The Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betts. Chapter 1. Jean-Marie Vianney walked down the lane, a shepherd's crook in one hand, a little statue of the Madonna in the other. The sheep and the donkey he was driving pushed on instinctively toward a small valley where the lush land was fed from a cool stream. Jean-Marie liked the little place because of a hillock in the center of the field, a hillock which, as soon as he arrived, became an altar to Our Lady. A horseman clattered down the road. "Boy," he called to Jean-Marie, "have you some cool water you can give me?" "I'm sorry I don't have any with me, but in the valley there is a spring of the best water to be found in these parts." "What valley? How far away is it?" "Just a little way ahead. I'm taking these animals to graze there," explained Jean-Marie. "Good." The man alighted from his horse. "I'll walk along with you." Jean-Marie looked at him with interest. He was dressed in clothes made of cloth like that in the suit the mayor wore on very special occasions, and this man wore it to ride the dusty roads. The leather in the saddle he rode was soft and fine, so soft it barely creaked as he dismounted. How different from the leather the farmers use for their harnesses and saddles! The man led his horse, fitting his steps to those of Jean-Marie and the flock he drove. "I'm tired from hours in the saddle," he said. "Have you come far?" "From Paris." "This morning?" The man laughed, a loud booming roar which startled the sheep and sent them scattering. Jean-Marie had some trouble calming the skittish creatures and started them on their way again. "I'm sorry, young shepherd, that my amusement caused you trouble, but I found the idea of riding here from Paris in one morning very funny. You are an ignorant peasant, aren't you?" "Yes," the boy agreed simply. He went on. "Is Paris so far, then?" "Yes, Paris is much more than one morning's ride, and I have come really much farther than that, for I have been in Italy with Napoleon Bonaparte's army." "And who is Napoleon Bonaparte?" The man paused for a moment, considering. "He is a Corsican, a young man who loves France and who has led the French army to victory in Italy, and he is the greatest general the world has ever seen." "Is he a good man?" "A good man? You are stupid. Didn't I just tell you that he is the greatest general that—" "My mother says that people use the brains the Lord gives them and can't do more," returned Jean-Marie with dignity. "By good, I meant, does he say his prayers? Does he—" "I wouldn't know anything about that, although I would suppose that he has more sense." The horseman seemed angry at the mention of prayers. "Where is that spring you spoke of?" "Halfway down this hillside, sir. The water comes out pure and cool from between some rocks. Your horse can drink from the stream below, if you wish it." "Good. He must be dry, too." They soon reached the spring. The man slaked his own thirst, and then led his horse the rest of the way down the little hill to the stream below. When the beast was satisfied, the stranger walked over to where Jean-Marie had seated himself on the grass. "How far is it from here to Iculi?" he asked. "I don't know in miles, but it takes my father several hours to go there in the wagon. My grandfather and aunt and uncle live there," the boy added. "Do you know what time it is? I want to get there before noon, and would like to take it slowly, if I can. My horse is tired, and we have far to go." "I don't know the time. My father and brother can tell time by the sun, but I cannot. We used to hear the Angelus ring, and then I knew the hour. But of course there are no church bells any more." "And quite right, too," the man growled. "You don't seem to know very much, do you?" "No, I don't know a great deal. I don't learn quickly, although I like to study, and would be glad." The man was not at all interested in Jean-Marie's desires. He mounted his horse and rode up the hill toward the lane along which they had come. "Does that general, Mr. Bonaparte, does he let the church bells ring?" Jean-Marie called after the horseman. Whether the man did not hear him or whether he thought the question foolish, rode away without answering. The French village of Dardilly, in which the Vianneys lived, was far removed from Paris, but the actions in the capital pressed hard on all the people of France. It had been in July 1789, when Jean-Marie was 3 years old, that the citizens of Paris stormed the Bastille, released the prisoners there, and seized the guns and ammunition stored within the walls. It was the beginning of the French Revolution. The country people decided that they would no longer pay taxes to the feudal lords who owned the villages, and to make sure of not being forced to do so, In many cases they burned down the castles where the lords lived, and drove them and their families away. Next they declared they would no longer pay tithes to the Church. Earlier the King of France, Louis XVI, fearing that trouble was coming, had made a few changes for the betterment of his people, but he had not made enough, and many times, having made a change, he was easily persuaded to swing back to the old ways again. Tired of this insecurity, the people took things into their own hands, and themselves made the changes they wanted. Some of these were good, but, as is often the case, the unwise and disorderly among the citizens came into power. They seized all the Church property. They declared that hereafter all bishops would be appointed by the state. Further, it was announced that all priests must take an oath to be loyal to the state first, the Church second. Most of the priests refused to do this. So in May 1792, the Assembly which then ruled France ordered that within the week all priests who did not take the oath must be driven from the country. Some left France. Some remained there in hiding, wandering about dressed as farmers or laborers, bringing the sacraments when and where they could. In September of the same year, kingship was abolished in France. The following January, the king was executed. Before the end of 1793, France was at war with all the countries around her, and there was terrible poverty in the land. But to Jean-Marie Vianney, all this was very far away. His world was in the field where the sheep grazed. He watched them until evening came, and then he started home, driving the flock before him. In the Vianney kitchen on this particular evening, the water in the great pot hanging on a crane over the blazing fire was boiling so fiercely that it forced the heavy pot lid into a clattering dance. Mrs. Vianney hurried to the fireplace, and seizing a pair of tongs, swung the crane a little away from the blaze. "The potatoes will all burst their jackets if they boil so fast," she commented. "Have you sprinkled the spice into the cabbage?" The question was not directed to anyone in particular, but her son Francus answered, "The cabbage is ready, mother." "Then put the bread on the table." The boy opened a cupboard and took out a large loaf of dark bread, big and round and weighing many pounds. "And the cheese, mother?" he asked. "Will there be enough for all?" He measured it with his eye. "Enough for 15 or 20, he reported. "It should do, unless Jean-Marie brings home a flock of children along with the sheep." "Jean-Marie knows that he should always bring in anyone who is hungry and has no one to turn to." There was a little sharpness in Mrs. Vianney's voice. "Ever since your father and I were married, it has been well known that food and lodging were given here free to any wayfarer. Jean-Marie is doing only what he always seen done." She sighed as she bustled about, placing all the eating utensils the house afforded on the table to be ready for whoever might come. These were dreadful days, when a strong and able man could not find work that he was willing to do, and when, much worse, church bells were silent and many churches destroyed. She whispered a prayer for the brave priests who, although they were hunted like animals, still contrived to live and do the duties for which they had been ordained. What had happened to her beloved France that it seemed determined to wipe out all that was good, to cultivate only evil? A stir in the yard outside the kitchen drew Francus to the window. "Father has 9 men with him," he reported, "and one of them, oh, mother, one of them is the poorest looking man that has ever come to be fed." "Then we must give him the place of honor," said his mother quickly. "Has Jean-Marie come back with the sheep yet?" "He is just driving them down the lane. The sheep and donkey are his only companions, except, of course," he added jokingly, "for his little statue of the Madonna that he always has with him." "He is a good boy, our Jean-Marie," said his mother fondly. "He is responsible and very trustworthy for a boy of 8, and devout, too." "He knows his catechism well," said the older brother proudly. "I questioned him last night, and he was ready with almost every answer." The next few minutes were full of bustle and confusion. Some of the poor people who had come to be fed were abashed when they found themselves expected to eat indoors with the family. But in the poor unfortunates Mr. Vianney saw Christ, and he always insisted that they must be fed with the family. The great pot of potatoes was emptied into a wooden bowl, the spiced cabbage placed on the table, and after making the sign of the cross on its crust, Mrs. Vianney began slicing the loaf of bread. "The cheese," she whispered to Catherine, her oldest child. "There will be enough." There was little talk during the simple meal, but when potatoes and cabbage had filled the most aching cavities, some of the strangers tried out unaccustomed voices and talked with the children. Under cover of conversation at the far end of the table, the beggar on whom Frankel had commented spoke in low tone to Mrs. Vianney. "I have a message for you." Mrs. Vianney started and turned to face the man whom she had seated beside her. She found him intent on sopping up the good liquid from the cabbage with a crust of bread. "Is it something secret he wishes to tell me?" she said to herself. "What can he have to say that must be kept from the others?" She leaned over to pull the slab of cheese nearer to him, and with her lips close to his ear, said, "Later, my husband will show those who wish to sleep here the way to the hayloft. You remain behind." The cabbage, the bread, the cheese were gone. Everyone was filled, and there was even a potato left. The 6 Vianney children knelt at a little shrine in the corner of the kitchen and said their night prayers. 2 of the strangers joined in, the others left. Already the faith was losing its hold in France. Prayers finished, the children went to bed. "You will not stay the night?" asked Mr. Vianney of the man who still sat near his wife. "No, thank you, sir. I must push on." "Then I will show this friend where the hayloft is. You will excuse me?" His wife and the stranger smiled permission, and the father of the family left the house with the overnight guest. "It will be well if your husband can drive a load of hay to the farm of Mr. Dufour tomorrow," the stranger said. Mrs. Vianney's heart leaped up. "Mass?" she breathed. "Yes, in the loft of the barn." "Are you the priest?" "No," smiled the man. "I am just a messenger for Father Balley. The man in the barn is a friend, too, but we thought it best not to seem to know each other." "What terrible times!" The stranger smiled. "The Church was strong in the years when Christians fled to the catacombs," he said. "It is still strong. Now you must tell me to which farms hereabout I should bring the message." Together they went over the list. Mrs. Vianney sent him only to those families of whose fidelity she was perfectly sure. "There might be others who would like to go, but—" "But we must be sure, Mrs. Vianney," said the guest. "We are staking our lives on each one we tell." "And the life of a good priest," said the woman solemnly. "What about the man in the barn?" she asked suddenly. "What will he do?" "He will ride on the load of hay. He is on his way to Ecouly, and it is reasonable that he should get a lift for part of the way." "What time should we leave?" "I don't know just how long it will take you to get there, but Mass must be finished and most of the wagons gone before daylight." "Won't the neighbors think it strange that so many loads of hay go to Mr. Dufour's, and then home again?" The stranger smiled. "Only half a dozen families will be notified of the Mass. You and your husband will come on the hayload, and perhaps one other couple will do the same thing. If either of the men has hay or produce for sale, he can go on into Ecouly. With each of the others I will make a different arrangement. All that is necessary is that we should have a few hay wagons backed up to the barn door, so that entrance would not be easy for anyone who wished to interfere with the Mass." "You spoke of other couples. The children may not come?" "We cannot have the children. It would make the group dangerously large. And if there were trouble—" "I understand." Mrs. Vianney sighed deeply. "Catherine is a wise and sensible little person. I will tell her to take care of the smallest ones while I am gone. And my poor Jean-Marie, he would so love to go to Mass. How am I to make Christians of my family when they cannot receive the sacraments, cannot go to Mass?" "I think you are doing your part very well," the man said smilingly. "As for the rest, it will come." He left the warm kitchen and went out into the cool April dusk. He and Mr. Vianney spent a long time talking together. Then, with the help of the other mendicant, they tossed hay from the bulging loft where it had been carefully stored into a wagon standing below. Somewhat after midnight the 2 Vianneys and their guests climbed onto the wagon and started out for the home of Mr. Dufour. They saw that the messenger had done his duty well. 1 load of hay was already there when they arrived, as well as a farm wagon with a load of poles up which runner beams would be trained. A donkey which had been ridden to the place was tethered nearby. "I will give the hay to Mr. Dufour," Mr. Vianney told his wife. "Grazing will be good very soon, and we will not need it." "Does he need it?" asked Mrs. Vianney. "He will find use for it. The children may need new mattresses to sleep on, and it will be less conspicuous if we do not carry the great load home." The little gathering of people knelt on the wide planks of the hayloft, and by the moonlight which filtered in through a dusty window watched preparations being made for Mass. A manger carried in from the sheepfold, with a plank laid across the top, was to serve as an altar. A linen sheet, woven half a century before by Mrs. Dufour, was the altar cloth. Wax candles stood in treasured candlesticks, ready to be lighted when Mass began. Over in a shadowy corner of the loft there was a low murmur. "Father will hear confessions and give us communion," whispered Mrs. Dufour. Tears sprang to Mrs. Vianney's eyes. It was so long since this blessing had been given them. If only her little Jean-Marie could be there, all the children! But for Jean-Marie, somehow, it would seem especially right. When confessions were over, the Mass began. Mass celebrated by a priest whose frail body and sunken eyes told of the difficulties under which he had come to them. Just before the Paternoster, there were voices on the road which ran past the farm. Loud, unpleasant, drunken voices. Even if they don't actually hate Catholics, they would know we are fair game, and might decide to have what they call fun at our expense, thought Mrs. Vianney. She saw the men of the congregation exchange uneasy glances. "Et ne nos inducas in tentationem," and lead us not into temptation, said the priest, intent on the prayer. One of the worshippers arose and tiptoed to the window to see if the voices meant any trouble. Luckily the men were moving off, shouting and laughing foolishly. Even if they had known, these drunken, cursing rowdies would not have cared that inside the stable Christ had once again come down to lie in a manger. Chapter 2. Jean-Marie was disappointed, very deeply so, when he learned that his parents had been to Mass without him. "I could have gone," he insisted. "I am almost a man, and I know all my prayers and catechism lessons." "But no children were there, no children at all," his mother explained. "Not even the Dufour children, and the Mass was said in their father's barn." "Well, I suppose I couldn't expect to go then, but I would have liked to," replied the boy with a sigh. In the days which followed, no one told Jean-Marie that soon after the Italian fighting the whole French army was under Bonaparte's control. Prussia decided that she didn't care to continue the war any longer. Shortly after that, Spain followed her example. A little later, Austria, too, made peace with France. So France now remained at war only with England and Sardinia. The Vianney family lived much as they always had. Things cost more and there was less money to buy them. More beggars than ever came to be fed. More and more families whom they knew lost fathers or sons in Napoleon's army. But except for these things, the Vianneys were almost unaware of the mighty struggle for power which was going on in the world. The General Bonaparte, of whom the passing horseman had spoken to Jean-Marie, was becoming a person of growing importance, was becoming more outspoken about his ambitions. "Do you suppose that I have gained my victories in Italy just to further the ambitions of the people ruling France?" he asked. "Do you think that my object is to establish a republic? Nonsense!" Napoleon Bonaparte was shrewd, and he was ruthless. He had the army largely with him because men liked to serve under a victorious leader, and Bonaparte had great skill as a military commander. While he climbed, step by step, into a position of power, he shrewdly changed some of the laws and regulations which were most irritating to the people of France. He did not believe, any more than the king had believed, that the people could rule themselves, but, when it did not interfere with his plan, he lessened some of the pressures which were making them unsettled. He did not return the church property that had been seized, nor did he at once change the laws which had sent most priests into hiding. But there was less open persecution of them. They were able to travel a little more openly, although they still had no parish churches in which to say Mass. So it came about that in the early spring of 1799, the Sisters of St. Charles arrived quietly in the little town of Eckeley to teach the children there. They could not have a parochial school, but they could at least live in a convent, and at regular intervals could gather the children into their home or the home of a neighbor to teach them something of their religion. Mr. and Mrs. Vianney talked over the situation. "Jean-Marie knows the answers in his catechism," Mrs. Vianney said. "At least he knows all the answers we have." "All we have?" her husband asked. "What do you mean?" "The baby got the book and chewed up some of the pages," was her reply. Mr. Vianney shook his head sadly. "Not many," his wife added hastily, "and she didn't swallow them. But they are of no use, and I forget what was on them. But even if we had them, I would not feel able to prepare Jean-Marie for his first communion." There was silence between them for a moment. Mr. Vianney watched the glowing embers in the kitchen fireplace as he thought the matter over. "I suppose it will be best to send the boy to stay with his uncle at Eckerley," he said at last, "though I will miss him. He is such a dependable boy, but his religion must come first." "I was hoping you would say that," Mrs. Vianney exclaimed. "I will miss him too. But it would be wrong not to take advantage of the chance to have him properly instructed, and he will learn to write and to figure too." Not people to waste time once an action had been decided upon, the parents told the plan to the children when they wakened them at daybreak the following day. "Your father will drive into Eckerley this morning," explained Mrs. Vianney, "to discuss the matter with your uncle and with the sisters." "Then I will go in tomorrow?" Jean-Marie asked eagerly. "That remains to be seen," answered his mother. "Today you and Frankels will take your pickaxes and loosen the earth in the far field where I plant the cabbages," instructed Mr. Vianney. When the two older boys worked together, Jean-Marie was always disheartened because he never could keep up with Frankels. "But he is bigger and stronger," his mother would explain. "Not so much bigger," Jean-Marie would protest. "If I tried a little harder, I think I could do as much." This particular morning he had a plan. A little statue of the Madonna had been given him some time before by a nun who was driven from Paris when all the convents had been closed during the Reign of Terror. She had found shelter for a while at her brother's home on a little farm near Dardilly. Her one treasure, the little statue, she had given to Jean-Marie because of his great love for Our Lady. When Mr. Vianney left for Eckerley, Frankels and Jean-Marie took their pickaxes and went out to break up the heavy clods of earth. As always, Jean-Marie had his little statue with him. The two boys measured by the length of their tool handles the distance there should be between rows. Then they set to work swinging the pickaxes down into the hard earth, turning up the clods, and breaking them into fine particles. Jean-Marie ran a few yards down the row he was working on, set his statue on the ground, and said, "Dear lady, help me to keep up with Frankels this far." When he reached the statue, he and Frankels were even. He set the statue a little farther on, and again asked for help. When the sun set, the field was ready, and Jean-Marie had done a full half of the work. "Jean-Marie kept up with me right through the day," Frankels reported. He seemed a little unsure whether to be proud of the younger boy or annoyed with him. Mrs. Vianney smiled. "He had a good alley," she commented. "Come, get yourselves washed, then look in the yard and the lane and see if there are any people waiting to be fed. With your father away, that is your charge, Frankels." "Oh, I hope the nuns are willing to teach me, and that my uncle takes me to stay with him," said Jean-Marie longingly. "Whatever God decides is best for you is what will happen," said his mother. "Yes, I know that, but will uncle and the nuns understand what God says?" His mother was spared an attempt to answer that question by the entrance of Frankels leading 3 hungry men. The meal was hardly begun when they heard the sound of Mr. Vianney's wagon in the stable yard. He came into the house, greeted the family, and made the guests welcome, then sat down to eat. In spite of the fact that Jean-Marie had spent a hard day working in the fields, his appetite suddenly left him. Had his father come home with a yes or a no? Other problems suddenly arose in his mind. Suppose the answer was yes. How would it be living away from his parents and sister and brothers? Would his aunt let him mold the clay statues and candlesticks, the making of which was his favorite recreation? The idea of leaving home to live in a strange place suddenly became a little frightening. Then he began to think of the nuns. He was not quick to learn, he knew. Would they be as patient as his mother and his big brother were? He would try his best, but would it be enough? Or would he make his mother's sister and her husband, Mr. and Mrs. Humbert, ashamed of him? His mind was in a turmoil, and his stomach very uneasy. By the time the meal was over, the poor people bedded down in the haymow, and the family gathered around the fire. "Well, Jean-Marie, I won't keep you in suspense any longer," smiled his father. "Your uncle and aunt are delighted at the thought of having a boy in the house again, and the sisters of St. Charles will gladly instruct you." Jean-Marie drew a deep breath. He looked around at the family gathered in the kitchen. Eckerley was the best part of a day's walk, so he would not see them often while he was at school, and, somehow, he had never loved them so much as he did just then. "When will I go?" he asked in a rather small voice. "The day after tomorrow. I must put a patch on your shoe tonight, and I'm sure your mother will find things to be done before you are ready." "Indeed, yes. He can go barefoot tomorrow, while I wash both of his pairs of stockings. And Frankos, let him wear your underclothes, so I can launder both of his sets. Jean-Marie," she added, turning to the young would-be traveler, "give me your suit when you go to bed, so I can darn any thin spots, and make sure no buttons are loose." "I will get up early and make you a package of food to carry," offered Marguerite. "That won't be necessary," Mr. Vianney assured his daughter. "We will be there before noon." "Just think of it! Jean-Marie will sleep here tonight, and tomorrow night and the next night he will be in Eckerley." None of the Vianney children had ever been out of their village of Dardilly. As far as they were concerned, the neighboring town was at the end of the earth. They looked with great respect at the brother who not only was going so far away, but was going to remain there for a while. "Frankos, run to the workshop and bring me a piece of leather," directed Mr. Vianney. "A piece about so big." He measured the size he wanted between his thumb and forefinger. "This shoe is cracked here, and will break right through if I don't stop it now." Frankos sped to the workshop at one end of the barn. Mrs. Vianney got her sewing basket, lighted a candle on the kitchen table, and settled down to her mending. Jean-Marie set to work waxing and polishing the shoe which didn't need mending. The other children tried to find jobs to do in this important family project, but succeeded only in confusing things. So all the young people were sent to bed, while Mr. and Mrs. Vianney worked to prepare Jean-Marie to go out into the world. The next morning but one, Jean-Marie's clothes were folded neatly and packed into a small box. The boy's mind was in a less orderly state than his wardrobe. He was afraid to leave home, even though he would not be with strangers. Yet he was burningly anxious to go to school and to prepare for his first communion. One emotion and then the other took possession of him until he was completely confused. Before he could sort out his thoughts, he and his father had arrived at Eckerley. He was settled in his uncle's home, and his father had left. Then began the difficult days. Jean-Marie was a hard worker, a conscientious student who toiled ceaselessly to learn his assigned lessons. Learn them he did, but when he was called on to recite, his memory always failed him. He stammered and stuttered and lapsed into miserable silence. Despite this, the nuns sensed a quality in the boy which made them willing to give him special attention. He moved along with his class, and at last the great day came. June in 1799 had been unusually fine so far, but one particular morning seemed to outdo all that had gone before it. From before daylight, wagons and carriages had been leaving the farms around Eckerley, and though the people in the various vehicles pretended not to recognize or even see one another, they all seemed to be heading for the same place, the home of the neighborhood nobleman, Count de Pignon. Quietly they tied their horses in the stable yard, and as quietly went in through the wide doors of the great house set among tall trees. A big room on the first floor had been arranged as a chapel. "See," whispered Mrs. Vianney to her husband, "the Countess has decorated the altar with flowers." Her husband nodded and ushered his children before him. Soon everyone was settled and waiting breathlessly for Mass to begin. At last the priest came into the room, and stood for a moment facing the congregation, but looking beyond them to the back of the chapel. "They come!" No one really said it, but at once all heads turned to look toward the door. 2 by 2, white veils on their heads and carrying lighted candles, the little girls of the First Communion class walked down the aisle between chairs and up to the seats near the altar. Then came the boys, faces shining, clothes well brushed, and wearing white ribbons on their arms. "Just as when we were children," whispered Mrs. Vianney. "The veils, the ribbons, the candles." "Not quite the same," pointed out her husband. "Then it was a church. Now it is a parlor with curtains drawn." Their whispers stopped and Mass began. When the services were over, the people arose to leave. It had been arranged that they wouldn't all leave at once. Such an outpouring would attract too much attention, rouse too much curiosity. "May we stay until the last?" Jean-Marie whispered to his father. Even when the others were all well on the way to their homes, the boy still didn't want to go. He fingered the rosary which had been his first communion gift, and gazed lovingly at the little altar. The next day, at home with his own people in Dardilly, he was called early. "You are a man now, Jean-Marie," said his father, "so you will do the work along with Francoist and me." So Jean-Marie, though small for his 13 years, put on his work clothes and started sharing the heavy labor, while one of the younger boys took on the duty of caring for the sheep. Chapter 3. "Jean-Marie, come and play quoits with us. We'll beat you this time, Jean-Marie." "You never have, so why should you expect to this evening?" "Because. Come on, Jean-Marie." The day of hoeing in the vineyard had been long and hot, and Jean-Marie was very tired, but he did enjoy playing quoits with the other boys. It was the only game of skill he played, and he was very good at it, so good that he invariably won. "Wait until I put my tools away." It was the custom in Dardilly to play for stakes, a custom which Jean-Marie didn't like. "Let's play just for the fun of it this evening," he suggested. "It's so long since I've played. I'm rusty. We'll call this a practice game for me." But his hopes for an unstaked game were not to be gratified. No, here's my red top. I'll wager that. I have 2 sous my uncle gave me." "Here is a knife. The blade is broken, but the half that's there cuts very well." As each boy laid his treasure on the little heap, Jean-Marie's heart sank lower. The boys had few possessions, and he knew what the outcome of the game would be. But he started to play, and, as always, he did the best he could. It would not have occurred to him to play dishonestly, even though it would be playing to lose. One by one his competitors were beaten. He was the undisputed winner. Unhappily he walked homeward carrying the winnings he did not want. All during supper his mind was absorbed with the problem of how to get the things back to the boys. Simply to return them would, he felt, insult the former owners who had wagered them and lost. "But they can't refuse presents," he suddenly decided. "No one is so rude as to refuse a gift." Delighted with the idea, he could hardly wait for the evening meal to be finished. When he had done his part toward the cleaning up afterward, he ran to his mother. "I have some errands to do, Mother," he said, hoping she would not inquire what they were. "I'll be back very quickly, but I must go now." Mrs. Vianney opened her mouth as if to ask where he was going, but decided against the question and simply said, "Run along." So Jean-Marie ran first to one house, then the next. "I have a present for you, Thomas." "A present?" "Yes, I heard you needed a knife. I have 2, so I brought one to you. The blade is broken, but what is left cuts well." His eyes were cast down, so if there was a twinkle in them when he described the knife, it didn't show. "But that's not—" "This is a present, Thomas," said Jean-Marie firmly. The boy was torn by conflicting desires. Politeness was esteemed in Dardilly, and politeness taught that one didn't refuse a gift, and he did want the knife. But he had no wish to be considered a poor loser either, yet Jean-Marie was insistent. "Well, all right," Thomas said gruffly, "if it's a present." "It's a present," Jean-Marie assured him. And so one boy after another got back what he had lost. Much happier, Jean-Marie ran home. "I like to play quoits," he thought, "but I must see if I can't get them to play without stakes. I really can't run around the village this way every night." By the following year, 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte was first consul of France. Austria had once more taken the field against him, but his army defeated the Austrian soldiers in several important engagements, and in 1801 Austria was glad to sign a peace treaty with Bonaparte. This man seemed to be blessed with great military genius combined with amazing luck. Other nations with which France had been warring followed the lead of Austria. From each, Napoleon collected tribute in the way of money or lands. In a few short years he had changed the map of Europe. Inside France itself conditions were bad. There had been waste and destruction during the Reign of Terror. There had been waste and extravagance in the years which followed. Now the country was almost bankrupt, and, what was worse, the people were so depressed that they did not seem to care. "Our roads are dilapidated. Our harbors are filled with sand, so that ships are afraid to come into them with trade," Napoleon's counselors told him. "We will rebuild the roads and clear the harbors," he replied. "Our industries are nearly dead. No one can afford to buy lace or linen or silk any longer. The government will set them on their feet." "The government has no money. Few people pay their taxes, and what little income there is goes to the army. Taxes will be collected from all who owe them, roared Napoleon. The people are resentful and unhappy. Free all priests from jail, that may please the people, and where churches still stand, let them be opened again. By 1800, a few of the priests who had been exiled had begun slipping back to their old parishes and taking up their duties, unofficially though more or less openly. In 1801, Napoleon signed an agreement with the Vatican, returning some of the church lands which had been taken. He still claimed the right to appoint bishops, but at least the churches could be opened again. Father Grabos and Father Balley were already established in Italy. As soon as it was safe, they began to paint and repair the church to get it ready for the parishioners once more. In 1802, Father Ray reopened the little church at Dardilly. Jean-Marie was one of his first volunteer assistants. Jean-Marie could read fairly well, and he loved to read the Bible. One day, working in the vineyards, he mentioned the miracle of Cana to some of the lads who were helping Mr. Vianney with the vines. "What's a miracle? Where is Cana?" Jean-Marie was somewhat startled by the questions. He tried to explain, but found the boys uncomprehending and very soon uninterested. "Oh, if it's all about God, don't bother," said one. Jean-Marie was aghast. "Don't you like to think about God?" "What's there to think about? I suppose there is a God, but—" "Stop! Don't talk that way." This was not the last time Jean-Marie was distressed almost beyond endurance. As the days passed, he realized more and more that many of the boys knew little and cared less about their Creator. "If I only had some more schooling," he thought, "I could teach them. Some day I might even become a priest." "He, a priest?" he grunted, dismissing the idea. "There's no use thinking of anything like that. I'm a peasant farmer, and a farmer I must continue to be." The idea had come to his mind, however, and no matter how much he tried to argue it away, it would not leave. He read his Bible and the Imitation of Christ, and wished that he had more time for prayer. Then he reasoned out a solution. "When I'm working in the fields," he decided, "I can be working with God. I'll do the sowing and the weeding, but He will be blessing it. When it's hard, I'll offer up the blisters on my hands. When it's cold, I'll offer up my shivers." And so it went on for a few years. But at last, at 17, he could not stand the pressure of the great idea any longer. "I am sure God wants me to be a priest," he told Father Ray. "What should I do?" "You have had very little schooling," the priest said doubtfully. "You can read?" "Quite well, Father," Jean-Marie answered happily. "And write?" "Not too well." There was less joy in his voice now. "Have you had Latin?" "No, Father." "No Latin at all? Nor Greek either, I suppose. Most boys who wish to study for the priesthood are well on in both languages by the time they are your age." Jean-Marie's heart sank. Then he brightened up a bit. "Father, couldn't you teach me some of these things? I would work so hard." "I'm sure you would, Jean-Marie." The priest smiled sadly. "But I'll tell you a secret. I may not be here much longer." At the desolate look on Jean-Marie's face, the old man hurried on. "Oh, I'm not preparing to die, or not any more than we should always be preparing at any rate. But my years as a hunted priest have taken their toll of my strength. I am sick and unable to do the work which should be done in the parish, so I have asked to be relieved." Jean-Marie left the house disheartened. He almost wept when he told his mother of his conversation with Father Ray. "I have often thought you had a vocation," said Mrs. Vianney, "but don't mention it to your father now. You would need more education before you could study for the priesthood, and an education would cost money. Just now your father is having a hard time raising money for your sister Catherine's dowry." So Jean-Marie kept silent, hoping that after his sister's marriage his own chance would come. But when he did at last mention it to his father, Mr. Vianney would not hear of it. Jean-Marie was too old, he argued. Jean-Marie was a good farmer, a fine, steady workman. Couldn't he serve God and save his soul while working on the farm? And education was very expensive, and he had no money. However, he soon had to find some money for another purpose. Frankels was conscripted into the army, and his father had to find and pay a substitute to take his place, as was often done at that time. Another year went by. Daily, Mr. Vianney beheld the pleading eyes of his son, and knew the special intention of his wife's prayers. Mr. Vianney gave in. "All right, You will have no peace, nor will I suppose, until you find out if you really have a vocation. We'll find the money somehow, but where will you go to study?" That was indeed a question. "I understand that Father Balley has classes for boys at Eckerley," said Mrs. Vianney hesitantly. "Perhaps I can go in and talk with him." "I want to go with you, Mother. He must see what a big, clumsy lad I am before he commits himself." "Big, perhaps," smiled his mother, "but to the clumsy lout I can't agree." When Jean-Marie and his mother reached Eckerley, they went at once to the rectory. Mrs. Vianney entered the house to talk to Father Balley. Jean-Marie waited outside in an agony of alternating hope and despair. Indoors, Mrs. Vianney suffered from the same emotions. "We need priests, yes," Father Balley said kindly. "But your son, you say he is 19. "Yes, Father." "That in itself would be a difficulty, but when we add to the fact that he is late beginning specialized subjects, the further fact that little or no schooling has gone before, I don't see how it can be managed." "But he is such a good boy, and he wants so much to become a priest." "I know, and I am very sorry, but you see I have classes of boys who are already well advanced in Latin. I do not see how I could take him. He would not fit in anywhere." Mrs. Vianney twisted her handkerchief between her fingers unhappily. "I don't know how I can tell him. He has waited so long," she sighed deeply. "Father, may I ask a favor?" "Certainly." "Will you see Jean-Marie? Talk with him? Tell him?" There was silence for a moment. "Yes, bring the boy in. I will try to make him understand and accept the situation. Perhaps I can suggest something." His mother opened the door and beckoned to Jean-Marie, who came running. She watched as he came, with tears in her eyes. "He is so thin," she thought. "He has prayed so hard about this. I hope Father Balley will be gentle in explaining." The boy, his thin arms much too long for the sleeves of the jacket which barely spanned his chest, was panting not from the running but from excitement. This was the moment he had wished for, worked for, prayed for, so long. Today he would take his first step toward the priesthood. "Shall I let him go in after all?" asked his mother. His mother wondered when she saw his eager face. "Shall I let him go in, or shall I tell him myself?" The decision was taken out of her hands by Jean-Marie, who moved swiftly around her and into Father Balley's little office. "You sent for me, Father?" Priest looked up, studying the eager, ascetic young face with his burning eyes. He started to speak, hesitated, studied the boy a moment longer. Then he smiled. "Yes, Jean-Marie, I wanted to tell you that I will be glad to take you as a student." And so it was that Jean-Marie went back to Eckerley to live and study. The months which followed would have discouraged completely any less determined person. At 19, Jean-Marie was in a class of 11 and 12-year-olds, and even so was far from the brightest in the class. And the children, not meaning to be unkind, couldn't help but laugh when the man, as they called him, stuttered and stumbled over answers they could give with ease. "It's my memory, or rather my lack of it," Jean-Marie would groan. "I know the lessons when I am studying them, but when it comes time to recite, the thoughts fly from my mind like birds from a cat. I just have no memory at all." He worked and prayed with equal intensity. There were moments when he lost all courage, but he always found it again. The people of Eckerley grew to love this quiet, intense lad who worked so determinedly to reach his goal. Then, in 1809, a new problem faced Jean-Marie. Chapter 4. In 1806, Napoleon had decreed that young men studying for holy orders would be exempt from military duties. In 1807 and 1808, Father Balley had sent Jean-Marie's name as such a student, but in 1809 he forgot to do so. So, in early October of that year, Jean-Marie was notified that on the 26th of that month he was to report at the military barrack at Lyons, the nearest large city, and begin his military service. Although that was the year Napoleon established the University of France, he was much less interested in educational work than he was in raising an immense army to keep his enemies in check. And for that war, unpopular with most of the people of France, he needed more and ever more men. "But students for the priesthood are exempt from service," protested Mrs. Vianney when she heard the news. "They are," Jean-Marie agreed, "but for some reason my name was left off the list." "I'll hire a substitute for you," Mr. Vianney promised. Jean-Marie expressed neither agreement nor disagreement with that plan. His father at once set about finding a young man who, for a sum of money, would serve in Jean-Marie's place. "Any luck?" Mrs. Vianney would ask each day when her husband came home. "None. All the young men I can find have either served already or don't care to do so now." But one day he came home smiling happily. On a farm some distance from Dardilly, he had found a boy willing to substitute for Jean-Marie. The Vianney's household was happy again, and Jean-Marie was deep in the studies which came so hard to him. But on the morning of the 25th, when Mrs. Vianney opened the kitchen door, she found a package and a note on the doorstep. The package was filled with coins. The note made her gasp. "What is it, Mother?" Catherine was worried by the shock on her mother's face. "What's all the money for? And what does the note say?" "The young man who was to substitute for Jean-Marie," said Mrs. Vianney with a little sob. "He came during the night and returned the money your father paid him, because he has changed his mind and does not care to serve." "Changed his mind?" Catherine was aghast. "But he can't." "He has," her mother repeated. "Then that means that Jean-Marie—" "Yes, it means that Jean-Marie must stop his studies and serve in the army." The news depressed the whole family, and Mrs. Vianney was especially distressed when, toward evening, Jean-Marie became sick with a burning fever. "You can't possibly go tomorrow," she said. "You should be in bed until this fever has left you." "I must go, Mother," her son said firmly. When Jean-Marie arrived at Lyons, he was told that he would train at Bayonne. Before his detachment was ready to leave, however, he was in the hospital. He had always been eager to do any job assigned him, and now, even though he was in the army against his wishes, he fretted at the confinement and inactivity of the sick room. Out of bed by November 12th, he marched with his detachment, but he was still far from well, and when they stopped en route to Rouen, he was again thrust into the hospital suffering from a violent chill. However, the officer in command had been given a certain number of recruits to deliver at Bayonne, and when in early January he was told to take his unit on, Jean-Marie, though not yet recovered, was ordered to leave the hospital and move with them. On the evening of January 5th, therefore, he crawled out of his bed, dressed, and started over to the captain's office to get his marching papers. On the way he passed a church and stopped in for a short visit. The church was cold and dark, lighted only by the little glow of the sanctuary lamp, and Jean-Marie, as usual, was sad that so few people stopped in to call at God's house. He said a few prayers of love and reparation for the coldness of others. He spoke of his longing for the priesthood, and asked for help in this strange life in which he now found himself. It was hard for him to tear himself away, but at last he did. He came out of the church quite unaware of the amount of time he had spent there. He hurried to the captain's office, and found it closed for the night. At first he was distressed, and could see no way out of his difficulties. He was supposed to march with his unit in the morning. He could not march without orders, and he could not get orders because the captain had left for the night. "I should have come here first," he berated himself. "Then when I had the papers, I could have spent all the time I wanted to in church. I should have remembered that the office closes at 6 o'clock. Remembered? How could I when I have no memory, no brain at all, I sometimes think." After a few minutes of such turmoil, he settled down and tried to think of a way out of the dilemma. "Of course," he smiled. "Why am I so upset? I'll get up at dawn tomorrow, be there when the office opens, and have my papers by the time the unit is ready to move." He did get up at dawn, was there when the office opened, and got his papers promptly. But there was one thing wrong with his plan. His unit had marched an hour before sunrise. The captain was furious. "And so, Recruit Vianney, you feel that the army should be run to suit your convenience?" "No, indeed, sir." "You were told to come here last evening for your marching papers, I believe." "Yes, sir." "Then why didn't you come?" "I did, sir, but the office was locked." "Why didn't you come earlier, or did you think I should wait here until it pleased you to arrive?" "Oh, no, sir. I started early, but I stopped in the church on the way, and—" "In the church? What are you, an old woman preparing for her last end, or a man preparing to be a soldier of France? France will need help, surely, if this is the kind of recruits we get." Red-faced with anger, the captain looked at Jean-Marie's papers spread before him. "I see you have been in the hospital," he said. "You were supposed to have ridden on one of the wagons because the doctors thought you were not fit to march. Well, you'll march now and at double-quick time." He scrawled a few lines on a sheet of paper. "Your unit has started for Bayonne on the Clermont-Ferrand road," he said. "You will set out immediately, follow, and overtake them. At the first long halt, you will report to the sergeant in charge." Heavy-hearted, Jean-Marie started off. He was still a recruit, had not been sworn into the army yet, so he had no uniform. But he did have his heavy regulation pack, which seemed to grow heavier each mile he covered. As a child driving his father's sheep or running errands for his mother, it had always been his custom to say the rosary as he walked along the road. He started now, saying Hail Marys, begging for strength, for the ability to overtake his unit. The cold wind cut his face and made more difficult the breathing, which was already painful because of his weakness and exertion. The strap of his heavy pack cut into his shoulder, and the road seemed full of round stones lying in wait to roll underfoot and twist the ankle of the hurrying recruit. He had had no breakfast. At first he had not minded this. When noon came, however, he realized that his weakness was not being helped by his fast. The sun passed overhead and was moving down the western sky. Lengthening shadows announced that the day was nearing its close. Jean-Marie, each time he climbed a small hill, would anxiously scan the road as far ahead as he could see. A large group of marching men, accompanied by several wagons, would stir up an identifying cloud of dust, a cloud that the recruit hoped with all his might he would soon locate. Each time he had a hill to climb, therefore, the ascent was made a trifle easier by the hope in his heart. But each time he reached the crest and found nothing, disappointment became harder. A horseman approached, coming from the direction in which Jean-Marie was going. The boy hailed him. "Have you seen a detachment of troops on the road?" he asked. "Yes, some time ago, about 2 hours perhaps. Why?" "I am supposed to overtake and join them." "On foot?" The man was unbelieving. "That wouldn't be possible. I've ridden 2 hours since I saw them, and they used the same 2 hours to march in the other direction." He looked with sympathy at the sick, tired boy. "Better give it up," he advised. "You'll never make it." The horseman cantered off about his business, and Jean-Marie looked longingly after him. Then he settled his pack so it was less uncomfortable and began slogging ahead. There was no hope of hurrying now. Just to keep going took all his strength of will and of body. Birds flew overhead, returning to their nests for the night. A man drove a yoke of oxen across the road, bringing them back to their barn after a day in the fields. Jean-Marie was glad to be compelled to stop for a moment as the lumbering animals went their way. When they had gone, it was very still. The day was over, and man and beast were preparing to rest. A single star appeared, cold and far away, and at last Jean-Marie accepted the obvious fact that he was not going to overtake his unit before they reached Bayonne. He finished another decade of his rosary, put the beads into his pocket, and looked about him for a place to spend the night. The rutted fields at either side of the road did not offer much in the way of shelter or comfort, but at the far corner of one of the fields, an untouched stand of trees marked the beginning of a forest. Jean-Marie decided to bed down there, rest his weary bones, and get a little sleep if he could. The fallen leaves of other seasons would make a satisfactory mattress. For a pillow he would use his pack. He knelt to begin his night prayers. "Hello, who are you?" Jean-Marie started. He had heard no one approaching, and he looked about to find the speaker. It was some moments before he distinguished a young fellow of about his own age standing among the trees. "Hello," he said. "I am Jean-Marie Vianney from Dardilly. And what are you doing here?" "I am saying my prayers," answered the literal Jean-Marie. "You came all the way from Dardilly to say your prayers?" Oh, no. I am here because I am a recruit in the army, and—" "The army?" The stranger looked about him uneasily. "Where is your unit? I thought you were alone." "I am alone." Jean-Marie told his story to the stranger, who listened with interest. "Then you are not really anxious to serve in the army?" "No, I'm not," Jean-Marie agreed, "but I was called up and I have a duty." "Well, come along with me for tonight anyway. I'll find a more comfortable place for us to sleep." Jean-Marie rose. "Thank you, sir." "Call me Guy. Never mind the rest," he added hastily as he saw Jean-Marie about to ask his family name. Jean-Marie stooped to pick up his pack, but when Guy saw the effort it required, he lifted it himself and swung it easily over his own broad shoulders. "This way," he said, and strode off through the woods. It seemed to the exhausted Jean-Marie that he followed his guide for hours through dense forest, up hills, down steep declivities, through streams. He had about reached the limit of his strength, when they came to a clearing in the center of which was a small house. Guy strode over and rapped on the heavy door. For some moments there was no response. Then, through a window, they could see a slight flare as of a lantern being lighted. The door opened a crack, and a man's voice asked, "Who is it?" "It is Guy. I want to talk with you." The door opened wider, and Jean-Marie saw the householder lifting the lantern high so that its rays would fall on Guy's face. Over the man's shoulder was the frightened face of his wife, peering out to see who had disturbed them so late in the night. There was a long, low-toned conversation. Then Guy turned and spoke. "You can sleep here tonight, Jean-Marie," he said. "And in the morning I will—" "We will see what happens in the morning," interrupted Guy gruffly. Thoroughly spent, young recruit Vianney slept heavily, so heavily that it was well after dawn before stir and movement in the house awakened him. When he realized where he was, remembered what had happened the day before, a wave of depression surged over him. He did not want to be in the army. He wanted to study for the priesthood. He had no affection for Napoleon Bonaparte, now self-crowned Emperor of France, no sympathy for the unjust war he was waging. But he had been summoned to serve in the army, and knew that his duty directed him to obey. He started out to do his duty, and through his own stupidity, as he saw it, had landed in an awful mess. He cringed at the thought of being brought to Bayonne in handcuffs, yet he was sure that would be the fate of a deserter, even an unintentional one. He had no appetite for the breakfast offered by the couple who had sheltered him, but he took it, feeling it would be ungracious to refuse. They asked about his home and family, and told him that they had been married the previous year. "I am a shoemaker by trade," said the man of the house, "but I am not doing so well because there are few people now who have the money to buy shoes." "We would be happy to have you stay with us," the wife put in shyly, "but we do not always have food enough for ourselves." "Stay here? I couldn't do that, anyway," said Jean-Marie gloomily. "I must move on." "Yes, I would take you myself to the home of Mr. Fayot, our mayor," said the young host. "Must I go there?" Jean-Marie saw himself paraded by the head of a local government, handcuffed, sent off in disgrace. "It will be best. Come, let's get started." Jean-Marie thanked his hostess for her kindness, shouldered his pack, and followed his host through the forest. "The mayor does not live in the town of Nuez, where the town hall is, but in this settlement of Robins. Here is his house." Recruit Vianney remained in the yard, miserable and somewhat frightened, while his companion went in to talk to Mr. Fayot. It seemed a long wait, but before Jean-Marie had finished the second decade of his rosary, the front door of the house opened, and a pleasant-faced, middle-aged man came out. "Well, Jean-Marie," he said, "we have been planning how we can dispose of you." "Dispose of me?" quavered Jean-Marie with visions of scaffold and guillotine before his eyes. "Yes, I already have 2 young men living in my barn, and I think it would not be wise to have a third. But my cousin's widow, Claudine Fayot, will be happy to shelter you, I know." "But, sir, perhaps you don't understand. I am a recruit. I stupidly missed my unit. I am at this moment supposed to be in Bayonne." "Too many young men are having their lives disrupted by a war which has gone on too long, which seems to us to have no justice in it," said Mr. Fayot firmly. "There are many men in these parts who do not feel bound to answer the self-crowned emperor when he calls." "Do you think that is right?" Jean-Marie was troubled because obedience to authority had been instilled in the Vianney children from the cradle. "Of course it is right. France needs young men at home, not dying in foreign lands in an unjust war." Mr. Fayot spoke very positively, and Jean-Marie assured himself the mayor was the person in authority, a representative of the government. "If you think it is best for me to stay here," he began uncertainly. "I know it is best," said the mayor. Chapter 5. Aside from the welcome he might have expected from his mother, Jean-Marie would not have believed anyone would receive him with such kind warmth as Mrs. Fayot showed. Sick, bewildered, unhappy recruit Vianney was swept into the hearts of Claudine and her children. He was put to bed, cared for tenderly, nursed back to health again. As his strength returned, he took stock of his situation. Without ever intending it, he had become a deserter. He was an exile from his family, a man outside the law, Yet to give himself up now would be to risk the safety of all the people who had been so kind to him. And, too, he considered the fact that his call to the army was the result of an error on the part of Father Balley. It would be best, he decided, to leave things as they were. He began a strange life, hiding in the barn most of the day, coming out only after dark had fallen. His emergence was always eagerly awaited, especially by the smaller Fayette children, for when he entered the house, story hour began. He told stories from the Old Testament and the New, the lives of the saints and legends about them. He read passages from the Bible each night, much to Mrs. Fayette's delight. Since her husband's death there had been no one in the house who could read. By March, a more normal way of life was possible for Jean-Marie. He took the name Jerome Vincent and was introduced as a cousin of the Fayettes, and with this new name and new identity he could go out in public once more. It was safe even to go to Mass on Sunday, a privilege for which he had been longing. The townspeople, completely unsympathetic with the Emperor's grandiose plans, did not inquire too closely when a new cousin appeared in the household of one of the neighbors, and if they noticed that the guests were all males and much of the same age, they never commented on the coincidence. Jerome Vincent soon established a little school in the Fayette home. At first it was meant only for the children of the household, but when the neighbors learned that the young Fayettes were learning not only to read, but also something about their religion, for Jean-Marie used a prayer book as a textbook, children from all the surrounding farms were sent to the classes. It was not long, in fact, before young and even older men began drifting into the school. The language Jean-Marie used was simple. His own education had been sketchy, but he seemed to have something in him which reached out to his hearers. To each, whether child or man, the words seemed a message meant just for him. Through the month of March the classes continued. In April the snows melted, and the earth was ready for turning and seeding. Jean-Marie had had enough of life indoors, and now that it was safe for him to be seen, he took up a spade and joined the men working in the fields. "Hello, the schoolmaster is joining us." Although by now he was very popular with the people of Providence, the men smiled at the thought of the frail-looking schoolmaster doing heavy work. But when he threw off his coat and began digging, the men saw that he was no novice at the job, and that experience made up for lack of brawn. And as he proved that he was able and willing to do his part in the manual labor of the place, the affection in which he was held became even stronger. His classes, moved to the evening hours now that preparation for crops filled the days, became larger and larger. Men came at first out of respect for the young man. They continued to come because of the information and the guidance he gave them. The people of the settlement of Providence and of the town of Noailles were proud of Teacher Jerome, and determined that he should stay with them, that he should not waste his youth and perhaps his life in army service. Since the police were aware that the woods around Noailles were full of deserters, they sent out search parties at intervals. The searchers were rather half-hearted in their efforts, did not exert themselves too much, but when they drew in their nets they usually had a few young men. In order that Jean-Marie should not be included in any of these captures, self-appointed sentries along the various roads leading to the Fayette farm watched for searchers. When a group of police rode past, a child was sent flying across the fields with a warning. One hot day in July a red-faced, panting lad rushed to the fields where the Fayettes were haying. "They come! The men looking for soldiers are coming!" "Run to the house, Jerome. You know where to hide," called Mrs. Fayette. "Not the house," warned her son. "The soldiers will see him as they come down the hill." "To the barn, then. You go with him, Jean," she said to her own son. "Take him up into the haymow and fork a good pile of hay over him." The two young men ran. Claudine kept the neighbor's child with her and thrust her son's hay fork into his hands. "Work," she directed. "Look busy." Jerome's fork she took herself and set to work with vigor. "Good day," called a voice from the road. "We are looking for deserters from the Emperor's army, and we are going to search your farm." "Search my farm? Why should you do that?" Mrs. Fayette tried to keep her voice steady. "We have told you." "But there is—" "We are searching your farm, madam. You and your son remain here." "I'm not—" The young messenger had been bewildered enough when pressed into work with the hay fork, but now that he was being counted as son in a family not his own, he started to protest. A sharp glance from Mrs. Fayette silenced him. "You are not what?" asked the soldier suspiciously. The little boy suddenly understood the situation. "I'm not going to stay here in the sun." he said, pouting. "I am going to wait there in the shade of the hedgerow. If you do not object, that is." "All right. You both may go over there. It's farther from the house, anyway." The soldiers wheeled their horses and rode toward the farm buildings. The house was so small and so sparsely furnished that a few minutes' casual search satisfied them no one was concealed there. Then they went to the barn. "Who's there? What do you want?" Jean-Baptiste stepped out of the cool dark of the barn and shaded his eyes against the sun. "Police, looking for deserters." "Come right along if you must. You won't mind if I keep on with my work. The handle of my hoe is broken, and I'm putting a rivet in it." "Go right ahead. You won't disturb us." Jean-Baptiste seated himself on the great grain chest and went calmly on with his task. The soldiers tramped around the barn, searching in dark corners and behind piles of lumber. "Try the haymow," directed the leader. Jean-Baptiste smiled a little and moved to seat himself more securely on the chest. One of the soldiers noticed the smile and spoke to the officer in charge. "Come down," he ordered the men who were climbing the ladder to the haymow. "Search that chest." They descended and walked over to Jean-Baptiste. "Get off there," they ordered. "There is nothing in here but grain," he said, continuing his work. "Off!" The order was sharp and angry. "You're wasting your time," said Jean-Baptiste. But as the determined men moved toward him, he slipped from his perch and stood watching. The police moved toward the grain bin, and one took hold of each end of the heavy lid which covered it. The officer in command and a companion stood back, ready to seize the man they expected to leap out and make a break for safety. The lid was thrown back. The chest was full of grain. "You see, I spoke the truth," said Jean-Baptiste, suppressing a smile. "Fortunately for you," the leader of the police was embarrassed and angry. "Come, we're wasting time here. We'll go to the forest and do our hunting there." The clatter of hoofs in the stable yard drowned out a mighty sneeze from the haymow above. Jean-Baptiste looked out of the barn door and saw that the police were now on the high road and hurrying away from the house. He quickly ascended the ladder and began tossing the great heap of hay to one side. "It's fortunate you held back that sneeze," he said. "If it had come a few minutes earlier, you'd be in irons now." "I know." The schoolmaster's face was uncovered, and he was wiggling to get his arms free. "I'd been fighting it for a long time." He was interrupted by another sneeze. "I never before realized just how dusty hay is, and I seem to have had some field mice for companions, too. Oh, I don't like this being an outlaw." Jean-Baptiste stopped his work. "You don't like living here?" "It's not that at all. Your mother is a second mother to me, and you are my brother. But it's such a disorderly, unnatural life I am living. I want to become a priest and teach the Word of God." "You are teaching," said Jean-Baptiste quietly. "The children hereabouts know their prayers and catechism, thanks to you. And many men who hadn't been to church in years now go regularly after hearing your teaching." "Yes, I know, and I'm grateful for that," agreed the schoolmaster. Months passed. By now the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte ruled most of Europe. He had established a system of dependencies, which included so much of the continent that it was possible to travel from the Baltic Sea to Naples and never leave land controlled by France. He wanted a son to inherit this vast power, and since his wife Josephine had none, he divorced her and married the Archduchess Marie Louise of Austria. By this marriage, the adventurer from Corsica became allied to the oldest and proudest royal family of Europe. Napoleon ordered great celebrations all over his empire to mark his illegal marriage. There were fireworks and feasting, and as a gift to the people, he ordered an amnesty, forgiveness for all the young men who had avoided service between the years of 1806 and 1810. So it was that, just after New Year's Day, 1811, Jean-Marie Vianney returned to his parents' home. The people of Noes and of the little settlement of Robins hated to see him go. All loved him, and many had come to depend on the wisdom of his advice. "He always seems able to see what the listener needs to hear," they agreed. And when they at last realized that he was really leaving them, they determined that he must do them credit when he reappeared in his own home. There was real competition among them to see who could contribute most towards sending him back in style. A cloth merchant who had some good black material on hand offered that as his share, and the Noes tailor gave his services in making it into a soutane. Jean-Marie had to try it on and be viewed by all his friends. "But your shoes! They are old and cracked and look very bad showing under your fine new soutane." The shoemaker got to work with donated leather and made a sturdy pair of boots. "You will have your own parish soon," said Mrs. Fayot, "and you will need—" "But, Mother Fayot, I am a long way from being a priest yet, let alone having a parish." "You will be a priest," said Mrs. Fayot with assurance, "and your table must look well when important people come to dine. Here are a dozen linen napkins, my wedding napkins. I want you to take them." Little souvenirs, treasured for years, came from almost every home. One woman brought a bag with 3 gold coins. "But this is all the money you have in the world," protested Jean-Marie. "I can't take this." "You'll need to buy books," the woman argued, "and I'll have more soon. I am fattening a fine pig." Mrs. Vianney welcomed her son with joy almost too great to endure. His father, although happy to see him, was somewhat less enthusiastic. "You gave me a hard time running away and hiding as you did," he said sternly. "But I didn't run away. I've told you how it happened, Father." "Almost every day the recruiting officer was here. He would not believe. I did not know where you were," Mr. Vianney continued, paying no attention to Jean-Marie's protest. "I was threatened with the loss of my home and all my property if I did not tell where you were." "But I was sick at first. I did not realize." "You got well. Then you should have joined your regiment. You gave us all a very bad time." When he saw the distress on his son's face, Mr. Vianney relented a little. "It's all over now, anyway, and we are glad to have you back again." And he went on about his business. "Do you think I can continue my studies?" Jean-Marie asked his mother when they were alone. "Oh, yes, you must." "But perhaps Father Balley—" "Father Balley expects you," his mother interrupted. "When we did not know where you were or what had become of you, I was so worried I was almost sick. So I went into Ecoli to talk with the good Father." Jean-Marie waited eagerly. He listened patiently for a while, but then he became a little angry. "Angry? With you?" "Yes. He said I had no confidence. 'Go away,' he told me. 'I assure you that your son will be a priest.'" 2 weeks later, Jean-Marie was back at Ecoli. This time, instead of living with his cousins, he stayed at the priest's house so that he could have constant help and direction in his studies. He was 25 now, and knew less Latin than many boys half his age, but he was more than ever determined to study and learn, to move ahead toward the priesthood. Day and night he tried to crowd the lessons into his mind, to master the Latin, which he must know if he was really to understand the lessons taught and recite it in that language. For relaxation he worked in the rectory garden, alternately praying and reciting lessons to himself as he did so. "Vegetable seeds produce vegetables, vines produce grapes," he would mourn. "Everything does its duty except my stupid brain. I wonder if I will ever be able to learn all I must know." "Work, and don't be proud," counseled Father Balley. "Proud? I certainly have nothing to be proud of," Jean-Marie answered. The time was coming when he would have greater lessons in humility. After Jean-Marie had been with Father Balley about 6 months, the priest decided it was time for young Vianney to begin the year of philosophy, which he must take in the seminary. This was a foundation for the theological studies which would precede ordination. So Jean-Marie was sent to the minor seminary at Verrières, a sort of preparatory school for the major seminary of St Irénée at Lyons. Chapter 6. Although about 200 students were assembled at Verrières, there were only 2 classes in philosophy. With a group of 100 to be taught, no pupil could receive individual attention. Learning had been hard enough for Jean-Marie when Father Balley could concentrate time and attention on him alone. Now he was almost frantic. He was sitting under a tree one day when a new student approached him. "Sir, I wonder if you could explain this to me," the boy requested. "I explain something?" Jean-Marie was amazed. "Yes, Father. I don't quite understand." "But I am not an instructor, a priest. I am a student." "You, a student?" It was the boy's turn to be surprised. "But you are a grown man." Jean-Marie flushed and agreed. "I supposed you had a long service in the army," said the boy, finding this a natural excuse for the older student. "No, I was not in the army," replied Jean-Marie. "Well, then, you must be very stupid," observed the arrogant youngster. "I believe I am," said Jean-Marie humbly. This incident began a purgatory of teasing which Jean-Marie was to endure from the heedless and the malicious among his classmates. On the other hand, others among the students realized that there was something rare and unusual about the young man who worked so hard against seemingly overwhelming odds. The teachers, too, found student Vianney so worthwhile that an exception was made in his case. Instead of requiring him to recite in Latin, which always threw him into a panic, they allowed him to give his answers in French. Some of the students rebelled. Who is he that he should be given favors? A clumsy farm boy with no manners, others added. A simpleton. But among the wiser ones, more than one said, I'm sure he rates high in God's eyes. And before many months, even those students who had started out by making fun of their older classmate began to go to him for advice and encouragement in their problems. When they sought to consult him about some petty rivalry, some difficulty they were having, they always knew where to find him. He would be in the chapel, praying for help in his own problems. At the year's end, it seemed to him that he knew no more than he had on entering Verrieres. He was very homesick, completely discouraged, and more than a little tempted to give up the whole thing. I could help my father on the farm, he would think. He is growing old and could make good use of me. I'd work hard all day in field or vineyard, and in the evening I could teach religion to the children. That would be doing God's work. But then those thoughts would be swept away. God has called me to be a priest. I am sure of it. And in spite of the fact that he, the oldest student in the class, was at the tail end of it, his philosophy teachers were sure of his vocation, too. They sent him on to the major seminary at Lyons. There again he had a chance to practice humility. While the more perceptive and spiritual among the seminarians appreciated the true worth of the backward student, there were others who saw him only as a stupid butt for rather cruel wit, a figure of fun or scorn. He was industrious. There never had been a better worker at St. Irene. But in spite of that, and of the further fact that the teachers gave him private tuition outside his classes, he could not seem to accomplish anything. A subject which he grasped in the quiet of his study left his mind entirely when he was questioned in class. Nevertheless, the rector of the seminary allowed him to continue his work there. "We will wait and see how you do in the examinations," he said to Jean-Marie. He, too, felt that there was something not at all ordinary in this young man, who worked so hard, who desired so fiercely to be a priest. Examination day came. For one of the few times in the history of the seminary, a candidate for the priesthood received 0 as his mark. In December 1813, a heartbroken Jean-Marie returned to Father Balley to tell him of the disaster. "I will never become a priest now," he said sadly. "Of course you will," said Father Balley sharply. "You have been called and you will serve. But it won't be easy." Easy it certainly was not. In fact, it required a high form of heroism to disregard the raised eyebrows of some of the people in Ecoli, to start in again, trying to make his memory retain the lessons learned with such agonizing labor. The misery of those days would have been too great to endure if his ears had not rung with the echoes of Father Balley's words. "Don't worry, you will be a priest one day." As the weeks passed, Father Balley grew to love and respect his people more and more. France was desperately in need of priests, he knew, since so few boys had found vocations during the Reign of Terror and the years which followed. He could not believe that the heart of God would not be moved to help a young man so determined to reach the altar. So Father Balley intensified his efforts. This time he taught in French, and before long he rejoiced to see that Jean-Marie was getting a firm grasp on his lessons and retaining what he learned. When examination time came around again, Father Balley went to Lyons with the request that his pupil be examined. "He is a most remarkable young man, and I am sure he has a true vocation. I have the feeling that as a priest he will do very good work." The Board of Examiners, made up of the best theologians in the diocese, agreed to let young Vianney try. "You must be very cool and calm," said Father Balley when he returned to Jean-Marie. "You know the answers to all the questions they might ask. Just think carefully and answer slowly. Don't get stage fright." But stage fright was exactly what Jean-Marie did get. When he saw the stern-faced examiners, he went into complete panic. Their questions he either didn't answer at all, or answered so incoherently that he might better have kept silent. Father Bochard, chief of the examiners, was an old friend of Father Balley. He tried to give the decision of the board as gently as he could. "We do not find the young man at all ready, or ready for our diocese, at any rate. Perhaps somewhere else he could pass an examination, or he might serve God in another way." "Father, please, no. He is a gem, this young Vianney, and we should make sure that he is a priest of this diocese. He was frightened today by all you grand people, and that is why he did so poorly." Father Balley paused. "Perhaps you could come to Eckerley tomorrow, and if possible, bring the Vicar General with you. Examine Jean-Marie there. You will see that he is ready." The two priests did go to Eckerley, and in the quiet of the house he loved so well, Jean-Marie did much better. So much better that the Vicar General was convinced. "We will accept him," he decided. "We will work with him and do what we can. The grace of God must do the rest." On July 2, 1814, Jean-Marie Vianney received minor orders at the cathedral in Lyons, and in August of the next year, in the chapel of the seminary at Grenoble, he was ordained. The physical act of getting to his ordination had required some of the same courage and persistence needed in preparing for it. Austria was once again at war with France, and the country Jean-Marie covered on his 60-mile walk from Eckerley to Grenoble was infiltrated with enemy troops, likely to begin action at any time. But that difficulty seemed slight to Jean-Marie when compared with those he had already overcome. After his ordination, he made a 3-day retreat of thanksgiving, and then set out on a long walk back to Eckerley. There, to his great joy, he was to serve as assistant to his beloved curé, or, as we would say, pastor, Father Balley. The people of Eckerley were as delighted to have Father Vianney with them as he was to be there. Father Balley's joy was deep and very real. He was still a comparatively young man, but worn out by the hardships he had suffered during the Terror. He saw much to be done, and knew that his own strength was limited. But he was so familiar with the consuming zeal and dogged determination of his former pupil that he counted greatly on the help the 29-year-old priest would give him. Yet the very unworldliness of Father Vianney, which made him so excellent a priest, created problems for the curé. The younger man was so intent on the spiritual life and priestly work that he had no interest at all in the world of appearances. While never dirty, he was almost always a little disheveled and shabby. At last Father Balley could stand it no longer. He bought a complete new outfit for his curate, clerical frock coat, knee breeches, and fine black stockings. And shortly after he got them, Father Vianney had opportunity to wear them. "Mrs. Vincent wants to consult me about the education of her sons," Father Balley said one morning. "I do not feel able to take the long walk, and anyway, your advice will be as good as mine. So will you walk up there today and see her?" "If you wish me to." "I do, and put on your new clothes. Spruce yourself up and do us credit. We don't want it said that the priests of Eckerley are Slovens," said the curé. Obediently, Father Vianney dressed in his new outfit. He stopped in at the church to say a prayer that his advice might be good, and then went his way in the sunshiny morning. Mrs. Vincent lived more than a dozen miles outside Eckerley, merely a pleasant walk for the former country boy. The afternoon was nearing its close when Father Balley glanced out of his study window and saw a bedraggled tramp nearing the house. He was about to hurry out to the kitchen to prepare food for the man when a second glance showed him that it was no tramp, but his own assistant. He sat down with a thump and waited for Father Vianney to come in. "Good afternoon, Father," the young man greeted his pastor. "I think we have solved Mrs. Vincent's problems." He paused, expecting to be questioned about the advice he had given, but there was silence of several minutes' duration. Then the curé spoke, spacing his words to give them weight. "Father Vianney, what happened to your good clothes?" Father Vianney looked down at his ragged breeches and smiled. "Oh, it was so fortunate," he said happily. "On the way home I met a beggar. He had lost everything, had no family, no home, and no hope. I talked to him of the love of God, and when he seemed to be encouraged a little, I exchanged suits with him. You'll help his confidence in Providence." There was another long silence. "You were on the way back from Mrs. Vincent's?" "Yes, Father." "Well, I can be grateful for that much anyway," said the pastor. The days and weeks and months went by. Father Balley had long been noted as a preacher. Father Vianney was young and simple, with much to learn. But it was the masses and other services at which Father Vianney preached which were crowded with attentive people, hurriedly breathing for fear they would miss a word. People came from surrounding towns to hear him, because, they said, "He tells us what we need to hear." He had endless patience, especially with the children, spending hours with them teaching, explaining, and reteaching those who forgot. The children, as well as their parents, loved him dearly, and would have liked to include him in their simple social life, but he had no time for that. There were so many things to be done, and not enough hours in the day to do them. Then, too, the only intimates he wanted were Christ and his mother. The little boy who had always carried the statue of Mary with him was now the priest who always had her in his heart. Father Balley was naturally delighted at the way his protégé had developed. Seeing that more and more parishioners were seeking out Father Vianney as confessor, he decided that he and the young priest should take up the study of theology again. In his early days as a student, we have seen, Jean-Marie had studied and been instructed in Latin, and Latin was always hard for him. Now that the curé instructed and discussed in French, learning for Father Vianney was no longer a feat of memory, but an exercise in understanding, in reasoning, and both priests were delighted at the progress made. These were happy days for the younger priest, and days of warm satisfaction for the older one, who knew now with certainty, if he had ever doubted it, that his efforts to see Jean-Marie ordained were more than justified. The rectory housekeeper, Mrs. Bast, knew that the curate's bed was seldom slept in. She suspected that he spent most nights kneeling in prayer or sleeping on the board floor. She knew the tiny amounts of food the two priests allowed themselves. She did not know, could not even suspect, their private mortifications and penances, but she did know, and the whole parish knew, that they had two very saintly priests directing them. It was toward the end of 1816 that Father Balley became ill, and most of the parish work fell on Father Vianney's shoulders. He became more haggard and weary, and also more shabby. One of the parishioners gave him cloth for a new cassock, and another supplied money to pay the tailor. "When will you get your new cassock, Father?" he would be asked. "Oh, soon, very soon, but I haven't time to see about it now." Before he found the time to see about it, and the tailor could set to work, Father Vianney had a visitor, a woman who came of a wealthy family, but who had lost her fortune, as well as her husband, during the wars. Sick and almost desperate, she came to the priest for advice. He talked with her a long time and sent her away comforted. He felt, however, that he himself should do more. He hurried to the tailor's house to ask for the money deposited to pay for the making of his cassock. The tailor was not at home, and his wife was most unenthusiastic about their losing the job. She thought up all sorts of excuses for not relinquishing the money, but in the face of Father Vianney's persistence, she at last gave in. That night Father Vianney secretly stole to the home of the woman who had called on him, and left the money where she would find it in the morning. Before another attempt could be made to get the cassock finished, Father Balley's illness took a mortal turn. The people of Eckeley were grieved by the death of the good old priest, who had served them so long and so well, but they found their grief lightened because Father Vianney was still with them. That he would be appointed curate, no one doubted. Even when young Father Trippier was sent to replace Father Balley, the people, though surprised, were not deeply disturbed. They still had Father Vianney. Then in February of 1818, word was sent to Jean-Marie that he was to report to the office of the Vicar General of the diocese. He was startled at what he was told there. "About 20 miles from here," said Father Corbin, the Vicar General, "is the little parish of Ars. There is a chapel there without a pastor. The curé recently died. The people, I am afraid, are mostly a worldly and godless lot, with little interest in religion." The Vicar General paused for a moment and studied the face of the priest before him, looking for signs of disappointment or displeasure. Father Vianney, he knew, had grown up largely in Eckeley. He had studied there, worked there, been happy and successful there. It would be quite natural to have at least a little regret about leaving it, especially since he would be going to a smaller, poorer, more indifferent parish. But no smallest sign of unhappiness appeared on Father Vianney's face. "How do I get there?" he asked. "Ars is remote," Father Corbin said. "It can be reached only by a narrow little road, but a cart can get through if you want to borrow one to carry your goods." "How soon do you want me to be there, Father?" "Within 2 weeks, if you can manage it." The Vicar General paused. "I seem to remember that you were determined to become a priest in spite of odds against you, that you wanted to do God's work and teach His word." "That is right, Father." "Well, I must tell you this. When the Reign of Terror came, and priests and sacraments disappeared, their disappearance from Ars was permanent. The people there are cold and unfriendly, most of them. They feel that religion would interfere with their pagan way of life, so they keep religion out. A few will welcome you as a curé, but very few. On the whole, you will find that your presence is resented, your work ignored or hampered. They certainly need a priest, the people of Ars. God bless you and give you strength for your work there. You'll need it." Chapter 7. It was foggy and rainy and cold the morning of February 9th, 1818, when Jean-Marie left Écully to go to his new parish at Ars. He had hired a man to carry his scanty clothing, his books, and Father Balley's bedstead, which, with a few blankets, was his inheritance from his beloved old pastor. Unaccustomed to riding, Father Vianney walked on ahead of the cart. Men left their work, women ran to the doors of their houses to wave good-bye to their beloved priest. The children, his particular charge, cried as they kissed his hand and asked for his blessing, and tiny tots, unstrung by the sadness they did not understand, added their wails to the general lamentation. The priest, however, was intent on the parish to which he was going. The picture of it which the Vicar General had given him showed a place in sad need of reorganization. He framed a greeting to have ready for the first of the parishioners who should come out to welcome him. On that early contact a great deal would depend. As he moved into the valley where Ars lay, the air seemed to become heavy and depressing. A great chateau stood on a hill to the north of the village. In it, Father Vianney had been told he would find a friend, one of the good women whose family had clung to the faith when others were letting it go. When he crossed the boundary line of his new parish, he knelt on the ground to ask divine help and guidance in his work there. Darkness came down as the short, thin, almost emancipated priest trudged onward. Once in a while, now, he would see yellow lamplight shining out of the windows of houses hidden among the trees. But no one seemed aware that their new pastor was coming, or if they did know, they did not care. No one came out with a greeting, no word of welcome was spoken. When he reached the village of Ars, he went directly to the little church which was to be his care. The steeple was gone, destroyed by the revolutionaries in 1793, though the bell had been saved, and now hung on a crazy structure of beams across the rafters of the building. His heart was unhappy at the all too evident neglect in the church itself, a church in which no sanctuary lamp burned because the Blessed Sacrament was not there. The carter unloaded his wagon, said a sad goodbye to his beloved Father Vianney, and started home. The priest cleaned the church as well as he could, straightened out his own mud-walled cottage, and went to bed for his first night in Ars. Before daybreak the next morning, the new Curé of Ars rang the Angelus, wondering as he did so if bell, rafters, and even part of the roof would come crashing down. A small handful of older women, no men and no young people, hurried in for Mass. Knowing that almost all of his parishioners were farmers, Father Vianney decided after Mass that he would walk around each morning and meet them at their work, or call on the families at meal times, when all would be at home. Having been a farmer himself, he knew how their day went, and knew, too, what to talk about with them. His face in repose was certainly not handsome, but his smile, illumined as it was by goodness and love, usually won over the people whom he greeted. When he called at their homes, he was always able to make friends with the children, whom he then urged to come to catechism classes. The oldest and the youngest among his flock were no particular problem. If they had forgotten their way to church, or had never learned it, he felt that it would soon become familiar to them. The young adults were a different matter. A madness for pleasure had swept France in the past years. Work was hard, tiny incomes were heavily taxed. God had been ridiculed as an ancient superstition. The result was that a whole generation had grown up with no knowledge of any commandment except the one which said, "Have a good time wherever and however you can." Sundays and holy days were ideal to these people for a round of worldly pleasure. Those who did not care for roistering simply carried on with their daily work. On Saturday evening a band concert gave the signal for the revels to begin. Sunday morning resounded to more band music, followed by public games and dancing, which continued well into the next morning. There was one church in Ars largely ignored, but there were 4 taverns which, particularly on Sundays and holy days, were full to bursting. In a pleasure-mad section of a pleasure-bent country, Ars stood out as the center of wild carousals, and people drove in from many miles around to take part in the unrestrained celebration. Father Vianney was sick at heart. In his pulpit he used plain, strong language about these things. But the people who heard him were not the ones he wanted to reach, were not the ones who skipped Mass to go to licentious dances or to get drunk in taverns. Though his congregation did carry the message home, it made little impression. One Sunday he got up very early, long before Mass, and walked down the road to meet the musicians coming to play for the dance. "How much do you get for playing?" he asked. They told him. It was a good deal of money, considered in terms of his own $100 a year income, but he did not hesitate. "Here, I'll give you twice that sum," he said. "Now go home and forget the dance." There was great resentment when the would-be dancers learned what had happened, but a few people, having no other way to fill their time, drifted into the church to see what was going on there. The sermon, as usual, was what people needed to hear, and some of them heeded. The priest had driven in the first wedge in his campaign to separate the people from their evil way of life. His sermons, in which he assured the farmers that in making a practice of carting their hay on Sunday they were carting their souls to hell, had some effect. But the priest was anxious for a quicker reaction, so, once again, he decided on the direct method. Each Sunday before Vespers he took to walking down the lanes which farmers might use on their way home from work. Although the men strongly opposed the new ideas he was trying to introduce, they now had great respect for Father Vianney, the man, and would rather not be caught by Father Vianney, the priest. One Sunday, when the curé was going down the road, he saw coming toward him a wagon piled high with sheaves of grain. The weather had been good, and showed no signs of changing, so there was no excuse for the full day of Sunday work that the load represented. The driver of the wagon was not visible, but the priest recognized the horses as belonging to a wealthy farmer of the district. He seized their reins and brought them to a halt, then called the farmer by name. "Come out of there!" he cried. "From whom are you hiding?" The grain sheaves shifted, and from under the heap there crawled the red-faced, sheepish farmer. "Why did you cover yourself with the grain that way?" Father Vianney's large eyes flashed fire. I didn't want you to see me," the embarrassed man stuttered. "And did you think you were hiding from God, too? Did you think He couldn't see you under the grain? Does He not see everything you do?" The direct, powerful personality of the priest reached the conscience of the farmer. He, at least, would do no more unnecessary Sunday work. Life in the little French towns had, for centuries, been regulated by the bells of the village churches. The day's work started, paused at noon, and came to its close to the sound of the Angelus. The year after Father Vianney reached Ars, he decided that the crazy structure which supported his bell should be replaced by a proper belfry. From his own pitifully small store of coins, he himself started the subscription list. The Viscount of Ars, who lived in Paris, was visiting his mother in the chateau outside the village when the first moves towards restoring the church were made. He was so impressed by what had already been accomplished by the new curé that he joined his mother in generous donations of money and material. The church roof was repaired, little shrines were erected, and God's wardrobe, as the curé called the vestments, was refurbished and enlarged. The curé's own home was a peasant house built of clayey mud. Of the 2 rooms on the ground floor, kitchen and dining room, the stone-floored kitchen was used most. Father Vianney's own meals were frugal, almost non-existent, just as they had always been, but he kept food on hand to give the hungry passers-by, the homeless and neglected children. And while he fed their bodies, he instructed their minds in the hope of awakening their souls. Of the 3 bedrooms on the second floor, the one nearest the church was his, although the few hours of sleep he permitted himself were more often than not taken on the bare floor with a piece of wood for his pillow. Most of his time was spent in working and praying, and, after Christ and his mother, the one to whom he prayed with the greatest faith was St. Philomena. Not long before Father Balley's death there had been visiting in Ecouly a young woman named Pauline Jerichot, who later, we shall see, launched a great mission work. She, for good reason, had deep devotion to this young martyr. Miss Jerichot had told the two priests the story, not well known at the time, of the girl Philomena, who had died for her faith in the reign of the Emperor Diocletian. Miss Jerichot had been gravely ill some time before, so ill that doctors had given up all hope of her recovery. She had been carried, almost unconscious, to the shrine where St. Philomena's relics were kept, and there had been miraculously cured. Quite naturally, she was eager to tell as many people as possible of the young saint's power in heaven. At once, Father Vianney had been greatly attracted to the dear little saint, as he called her, and he turned to her in all his perplexities. To Philomena he would say, when he instructed the children, nothing is refused. She loved God so much that when she was just a little girl she died for him, so of course he listens when she asks. He credited to her all the success he had in Ars. However, he never simply turned a problem over to her. He worked hard and asked for her help in the work, and the work continued successful. His one feat in stopping a Sunday dance did not, of course, end those pagan revels, but things began to be a little different. Several times when the crowd gathered, he walked over and stood quietly looking at the people, drinking and rioting, when they should have been in church. The deep, earnest eyes, burning in the sorrowful ascetic face, spoke the words his tongue did not. Many of the revelers went home, and the spirits of those who remained were dampened. This angered the tavern keepers. "We have built up a good business here," they growled. "What does he want to do, ruin us?" Father Vianney did not want to ruin anyone or anything except sin. He would have liked to see the disappearance of the places which contributed so much to the drunkenness and debauchery of Ars. And, bit by bit, he moved toward his goal. When he rebuilt and refurbished his little church, he had installed a new confessional. There he began to spend more and more of his time. His fame as a confessor and adviser was spreading. In his early days in Ars, there were but two people in the village itself on whom he could count for help in the church. One was Mrs. Bidvost, his housekeeper, who lived near the rectory, and the other a Miss Pignot, who boarded with her. These two women cleaned the church, dressed the altar, and tried between themselves to supply periods of daily adoration. This, of course, pleased the curé, but he wanted more. He wanted church societies. One day a group of the giddiest girls in town had gathered in the village square, ready to start off on a round of drinking and dancing. Father Vianney saw them. "Here," he said to himself, "is my rosary confraternity ready-made. I'll go out and talk to them." He advanced to the green and greeted the girls pleasantly, pretending not to know what their plans were or where they were bound. "Come," he suggested, "let's go into church and say the rosary. We'll pray that whatever it is you're going to do, you will do well." The girls were upset and confused. To go into the church and pray was the thing furthest from their minds. Yet they did not know how to refuse this gentleman with the penetrating eyes. Each waited for someone else to laugh at the suggestion, to walk away. If one did, they all would, but no one had the courage. Against their will and wishes, compelled by a stronger personality than their own, they went rather sulkily into the church, knelt, and prayed. There was silence when they finished. Then one of the girls spoke. "I'd like to go to confession, Father," she said timidly. "I would too," said another. And so he got the nucleus of the little band who would help in his war against evil. Through these girls, among others, it became known that Father Vianney told penitents what they needed to hear. He scolded some, comforted and encouraged others. Often when crowds were waiting outside his confessional, he would step out and select one far down in the line to come first. For he knew unfailingly when the effort to come had been hard, when the long wait might give Satan a chance to persuade the penitent to leave. And, strangely enough, no one ever protested when a latecomer was given precedence over those who had waited for hours. They were convinced that Father Vianney's decisions were inspired. When Pope Gregory XVI, impelled largely by the work of Pauline Jerichot, authorized the cult of St. Philomena, the Curé of Ars at once built a little shrine in her honor at the side of the church. He was delighted when it became a center of pilgrimage. What he did not know, would not have believed, was that many of the people traveled to Ars only incidentally to visit the shrine. Their primary reason was to see, to talk with, to go to confession to Father Vianney. Now, the town itself had changed, so much so that the 4 taverns functioned no longer as such. They were now small hotels for the convenience of the many pilgrims. The old Ars was no more. When Father Vianney had been curé for 5 years, the bishop, amazed at all that had been accomplished, sent for him. The town of Salos was larger than Ars, the prelate said, but as much in need of conversion as Ars had been. Father Vianney, therefore, was to take it for his new parish, his new battlefield. The people of Ars were heartbroken and indignant. Father Vianney was theirs. Through him they had given up their old evil ways. Through him they had made their peace with God and received spiritual and material blessings. Although they knew their priest himself would do as he was told, they were less anxious to cooperate. "I'd like to strangle that vicar general," one young woman declared. "He must have told the bishop about the curé. It's all his fault that we are losing our saint." "Hush," said her mother. "That's a dreadful thing to say. It is the will of God that our good curé should leave us." "I don't believe it's God's will," insisted the girl, and it almost seemed as if she were right. The priest packed his few possessions and loaded them on a cart, ready to leave after Mass the following morning. But heavy torrents of rain fell that night, and the next day, when the cart reached the little river over which they had to pass on the way out of Ars, it was so flooded that crossing was impossible. So Father Vianney went back to the town to wait for the flood to subside. The parishioners, having ascertained that the curé did not really want to leave them, but was acting rather from obedience, started collecting signatures on a petition to the bishop asking that Father Vianney be left with them. The mother of the Viscount of Ars, the great lady of the chateau herself, headed the movement, and before they could present their request, Father Vianney packed up again to try to follow the bishop's orders. Again there was distress in the village, unhappiness that they had not moved faster in their efforts to keep their priest, dismay that all hope seemed gone. But again rain came, the river flooded, there was no crossing. This time there was no relaxation in Ars. They had had their hopes raised, dashed, and raised again. They felt unsure and insecure as they waited for word from the vicar general in reply to their petition. But where, in the past, disappointment and worry would have meant cursing and drunkenness among many of the villagers, now they turned to prayer, to daily Mass, and to more frequent communion. The flooded river subsided again, and across it came a messenger from the bishop. Father Vianney was to stay with his people. Now, more than ever, the pastor was the beloved shepherd of his flock. Almost every home had a warm welcome for him. He was in touch with every facet of their lives. Their work, their health, their herds, their crops, all were of interest and importance to him. In time of joy, in sorrow or fear, the people turned to Father Vianney. The children, always his greatest care, knew that they had an unfailing friend in him. He planned a school for girls, where the future mothers of families could learn to read and write and figure, but, most important, learn of the love of God. Pilgrims came in great and greater numbers, and one dreadful visitor came. Chapter 8. In one of his earliest sermons in Ars, Father Vianney explained why he preached so bitterly against the evil in his parish, why he marshaled all his powers to do battle. He could never, he explained, but must speak out against it, even if in doing so he made the people hate him. Even if a priest were certain of being lynched when he came down from the pulpit, he said, that must never stop him from speaking out against wrong. Although by far the greater part of the parish were now leading holy, useful lives, the devil still had a few followers, who liked the old ways better. Many of the men now said their beads as they walked to and from their work, but among them were some almost insanely angry at the changes Father Vianney had made. They composed drunken, wicked songs about him, threw filth on his house and even on the church, and they wrote anonymous letters to the bishop, accusing the curé of dreadful things. Some of the letters seemed well written and well reasoned, so the bishop thought it best to send one of his aides to examine Father Vianney, to inquire into his life and habits, and see if anything he did could really give rise to scandal. It was a grief and a humiliation for the Curé of Ars to be investigated in this way, but he answered humbly and simply all the questions, discussed all the problems. and the bishop's emissary went away convinced that he had talked with a very saintly man. But the devil, who had spoken through the scandal-bearing mouths of the angry villagers, was not giving up so easily. It had seemed, before Father Vianney's arrival, that a large part of the citizens of Ars were headed for damnation. Now, not only had most of them reformed their ways, but people from all parts of France were going to Ars to confess the sins of years to the Curé, to get help from him in living better lives. Hundreds of souls whom the devil had counted as surely his were slipping from his grasp. He would take direct action. For a while he taunted the Curé, tortured his mind. "You are not a good priest," he would whisper. "You are not doing God's work. If you ever hope to save your own soul, get out of here. Go to a monastery and spend the rest of your life in prayer." "You are not equal to the duties here," would come on another day. "You were stupid as a boy, and now you are a stupid man, too stupid even to see what a failure you are." Poor Father Vianney was torn with anguish. Were those thoughts only temptations, he wondered, or was the truth at last forcing itself on him? He fasted more strictly than ever, and imposed severe penances on himself, praying all the while that he might know positively what he should do. The devil grew impatient. He couldn't worry the priest out, so he would frighten him away from the place where so many souls were being saved. The curé had bought a house, which he was fixing up to be used as a school for girls. Here catechism would be taught. Here feet would be started on the road to heaven. The devil could not endure the thought. One night, as Father Vianney worked over plans for the school, he heard noises outside his door. There was something indefinably threatening about them, so the next morning he spoke to some of the young men of his parish. "I'm afraid some ruffians may be planning to break into the church," he explained. "Let us take turns watching, Father," one of the young men suggested. "We'll each take a night on guard duty, until we are sure no thieves are around, or until we catch them." The noises continued for 2 or 3 nights, but try as they would, the self-appointed guards could not see where they came from or who might be making them. Then came the turn of André Verture, the young man who had originally proposed the night watch. After night prayers, the curé and André left the church, entered the little house, and talked as they warmed themselves in front of the kitchen stove. They had been there some minutes when André shuddered. "Are you still cold?" asked the priest. "Can I heat up some milk to warm you?" "No, thank you, Father. I am not cold even though I shivered. I feel strange, somehow." The priest looked at him for a moment, saying nothing. "It's 10 o'clock," he broke the silence. "I'll give you my blessing and then we'll go to bed. I've not had much sleep lately," he added with a smile. The curé went to his room and André to his, but hardly had young Verture closed his door when there was a great pounding on the door leading to the churchyard. André seized his gun and ran downstairs, determined that whoever was disturbing Father Vianney's rest in this way would pay dearly for his fun. Before he was halfway down the stairs there was a rattling at the door latch, and from the other side of the house a banging as if someone were pounding on the wall with a wooden hammer. Then the house began to sway and tremble as if an earthquake were beginning. André Verture yelled to the priest, Father Vianney, come out quickly! There's an earthquake, and I think the house may collapse." The priest opened his door. "You have heard the noises, then?" he asked. "Of course I heard the noises. Why else would I have run out with my gun? But it's not the noises that I'm worried about. We're wasting time talking. Let's get out before the house falls in on us." "I don't think it will fall," said the priest soothingly. "See, the trembling has stopped. We'll go back to bed." The pounding and hammering as well as the tremors recurred at intervals all through the night. Neither the watcher indoors nor some others who had hidden outside were able to catch any sign of an intruder. After about 2 weeks of such doings, Father Vianney came to a decision. This attack on his rest and his nerves was not the work of hate-filled men. It was, the curé felt certain, the work of Satan himself. Furious because so many souls he had counted as surely his were now, through Father Vianney, changing their ways and earning their salvation, the demon was striking. The priest realized that the attack was being made on him personally, and he would have to stand up to it alone. He thanked the guards and told them not to come any more. The confessions continued, conversions mounted, and Satan became wilder and wilder in his efforts to tire out or frighten away this priest who was the cause of it all. Sometimes, just as the weary curé fell asleep, there would be a roar above his head, as if hundreds of mounted troops were galloping through the attic. Sometimes there would be shrieks and groans from inside the walls. Other nights a harsh, very loud voice would sing in the chimney of the fireplace in the curé's bedroom. "What a very ugly voice old Scratch has," Father Vianney would say to himself. "If more people heard him, fewer might listen to what he says." Sometimes the racket would continue all night. Again it would stop suddenly, only to start up louder than ever as the weary priest dozed off. "Ha, Vianney," the rasping voice would sneer. "You can't sleep and you can't pray. I'll have you yet, Vianney." Those were the worst nights, the nights when the awful voice actually spoke to him, taunted him. But the devil was wrong in one thing. The Curé of Ars could and did pray unceasingly. The neighbors, of course, all became aware of what was going on in their beloved priest's home. They, too, prayed harder and longer than they ever had before. They were deeply distressed when the curé would appear for Mass with face and hands bruised. This meant his enemy had thrown him from bed and dragged him across the floor. Satan was fighting fiercely. At this time, Father Vianney's sister, Marguerite, came to visit him, knowing nothing of the torture her brother was enduring. After they had spent a pleasant evening together, the curé went to his room and his sister to the guest room. She had just put out her candle when the pounding and hammering started. She rushed to the hall. "Jean-Marie, brother, come quickly! I am afraid!" Father Vianney ran from his room. "Has something disturbed you, sister?" he asked. "Yes, there was a terrible noise and something shook my bed. I had an awful sense of—" "Oh, that was only old Scratch," the curé said consolingly. "However, he won't hurt you. He's after me. And he won't hurt me because God protects me." He paused for a moment, his eyes twinkling. "Do you know, Marguerite," he continued, "old Scratch is not half so clever as people think he is. He gives me signals he doesn't intend to. Whenever some soul in deep trouble is coming to see me, some hardened sinner, old Scratch is particularly anxious to hold on to. He makes an unusually dreadful din, gets especially violent in his acts. So I am prepared and can pray for strong guidance. No, old Scratch is not so smart." In spite of his parish duties, the growing number of confessions, the sleepless nights, Father Vianney found time and strength to continue the work on Providence, as he called his school for girls. To procure the house, he had used every cent he could beg or borrow. Now he had the house, but no money to operate it. But he had a much more valuable asset. He had faith. 2 girls of the parish were to run Providence, 2 girls he himself had taught and trained. And they, too, had faith. The first morning they entered the house, the only provisions they found were a pot of butter and a little dry cheese. "Shall we go home for dinner?" asked Benoit Nardette, who was in charge. "Let's wait," her assistant, Catherine Lausanne, suggested. "We are living in Providence, so let us see what Providence will provide." Very soon Benoit's little brother appeared at the door, carrying a basket covered with a white napkin. "Mother had a feeling you'd have no dinner," he explained, "so she cooked enough for you both and sent it over." The 2 girls looked at each other. Then they bowed their heads in prayer, grateful for this proof of God's care. We have already seen that the school had been planned as a place for the education of the girls of Ars, but from the first it was so well run, had such a fine spirit, that soon parents from outlying farms and nearby villages sent their daughters to take advantage of the Christian training which Providence offered. Without at all intending it, the Curé of Ars found before long that he was running a boarding school for 16 girls outside his parish. The Emperor Napoleon had waged long wars, draining money and men from a country already poor in both. He had been defeated at Waterloo on 1815 and died 6 years later. But changes in government had made little change in the conditions of the population of France. Poverty laid cruel fingers on the people, and the people became cruel in turn. Boys were of help to their families. They could work and bring in a little money. Girls, on the other hand, were a care and expense, so they were sometimes lost or abandoned by their parents. If parents died, the boys they left behind might be adopted, but the girls rarely were. So the French countryside became accustomed to the sight of girls wandering around looking for a little work they might do in exchange for food and shelter. The people might become accustomed, but the curé never. In 1827 he told his parishioners that he wanted to build a shelter next to the school where the homeless girls might be cared for. He drew up plans for the structure at night. His ears might ring and his head ache with the shattering din made by his enemy, the arch-fiend, but he prayed and worked and completed the drawings. Then he took up his adze and chipped stone. He mixed mortar and carried it. He did anything and everything to help speed the completion of the building. More than one fashionable lady or grand gentleman who had come out of curiosity to see the saint was startled when he was pointed out to them, for the man they saw was a shabby little workman staggering under the weight of a heavy beam or load of planking. "Why," the visitor would gasp, "I thought the famous Curé of Ars was a big man." "Big? A big man?" The guide's eyes would flash. "Sir, there is no bigger man in all France." In almost no time after the building was finished, the dormitories were full. New arrivals were never questioned about their faith, or even whether they had any. If they were homeless, hungry, they were admitted. There was no age limit. Abandoned babies, miserable girls in their teens, their need was their key of entry. The little money which Mr. and Mrs. Vianney bequeathed to their priest son, he at once gave it to Providence. When it was gone, he started selling his furniture and his few possessions. He redoubled his prayers, spending much of the night in the shrine of St. Philomena, his dear little saint to whom nothing was refused. But one day in 1829 it looked as if the end had come. There was only a handful of wheat left for the floor to make the orphans' bread, and there was no way of getting more. No one around who had not already given all the alms he possibly could. Catherine Lasagne went to the curé. "What shall we do, Father?" she asked after she had told him of the situation. "Do? What do you mean?" Can we keep the orphans?" "Keep them? Of course we'll keep them." "But how can we when we have no food?" "You have no faith?" The curé stole to the granary where the wheat, when there was any, was stored. Under the pitiful handful of grain he hid a relic of St. Francis Regis. Years before, when Jean-Marie had found learning impossible and had feared he would never reach the priesthood, he had made a pilgrimage to Paris, to the tomb of the great missionary St. Francis Regis, to pray for aid in his studies. His prayer then had been answered. Now he called once again on the saint for help. The following morning, when Catherine and Benoit rose to wake their charges in time for Mass, they heard a creaking and groaning of timbers. "It sounds as if part of the building were getting ready to fall," said Catherine, white-faced with alarm. "We better hurry and get the children out." "Let's look first," suggested Benoit, "and see where the trouble is." They went to the cellar, but all was normal there. They inspected the stairway, but that too seemed secure. Bit by bit they went over the building, until at last they reached the granary. It was literally bulging with grain. The two young women fell to their knees to thank God. Some time later supplies once again were low. There was flour for 1 loaf of bread when 10 were needed. "Go and tell the curé," suggested Benoit. The little girl who was helping in the kitchen was sent running to Father Vianney. He shook his head. "Don't worry so," he chided. "You seem to have no faith at all. Go back and say your prayers and make the bread." The girl went back and put the flour in the mixing trowel. It looked like a tiny white island in the huge wooden bowl, and it was with great care that she dribbled in water. But the dough was still thick and needed more water, so she added more. When she began to knead it, however, it was still too heavy to be worked, so she added more water. The trowel now seemed to have as much dough as was usual on baking days, so she let it rise, pounded it down, and let it rise again. From the flour for one scant loaf, she baked 10 20-pound loaves, all that the great oven would hold. The girls at Providence ate heartily, and said that the bread was even better than usual. They needed good food, for their days were busy ones. They learned to read and write and to figure a little. They worked in the garden, and since most of them would work either in other homes or in homes of their own, they were taught to sew and knit, to wash and iron, to spin and weave. But most of all, they learned to know and love God, to understand His commandments, and to keep them. The girls of Providence Orphanage began to be known for their sweetness and ability. When a mother needed help with her children, or a housekeeper required aid, it was to the school of the Curé of Ars that they turned. When the girls were old enough or well enough trained to leave the home, there was always a good position waiting for them. They were not permitted to leave until this was certain. They were never happy when the time for parting came, for Providence was a good and happy place, the only goodness and happiness many of them had ever known. But among their earliest lessons there they had learned obedience. So they went when the time came and carried the results of their training with them as missionaries might. "We are the spoiled children of God," Father Vianney often told them with a smile. "When have we ever wanted anything? My children, always remember that you are constantly surrounded by the love of God. He is only waiting for you to call on it." The years went on. In 1830, the French seized Algiers. Greece broke away from Turkey and became independent again. Belgium separated from Holland, and the Polish struggle for independence began. All the world seemed in turmoil, but none of these things had any meaning for the Curé of Ars. 50, 60, 80 people a day were coming to the village to see the saint. The story of his works was spreading, to get his advice and consolation, to go to confession to him. The farm boy Jean-Marie Vianney had always loved the open air, had loved to watch the changing seasons, to walk in field and lane. Now from dawn to dusk he was shut up in an airless box, listening to stories of misspent lives, pouring himself out in advice and help. How long could he stand it? Chapter 9. Since he had first come to Ars, Father Vianney had never had a day, or even half a day, that was his own to do with as he liked. Now the pressure was much greater. He would go to church at 1 in the morning, or even at midnight, and hear confessions until Mass at 6 or 7 o'clock the next morning. Always awaiting him were long lines of people who had stood outside the church since the previous evening. After Mass he would return to the confessional until 11 o'clock, when he held his catechism class. At first the class had been for the children, both those who lived at Providence and those who came from the village and nearby farms. But adults, hearing of the helpful instructions the curé gave, crowded around windows and doors trying to catch his words. "We will move the class to the church, where all can be seated," Father Vianney decided. But it was not long before the seats were all filled and people stood in the aisles and on the porch. And still there was not room. In the afternoon he was once again in the confessional, where he stayed until it was time for the rosary and benediction which closed the day. At 9, as a rule, he went home, with his office still to be read. The crowds grew larger, 60, 70, 100 people a day, then 200, 300, 400. 5 horse-drawn bus lines were now serving Ars, the parish reached only by a cart track when Father Vianney became its curé. The railroad, which stopped at the station of a nearby town, extended round-trip tickets to a week. This was because people often had to wait 3 or 4 days before their turn came to make their confessions to the Curé of Ars. The 4 hotels were always filled, private homes were opened, and through the summer farmers set aside special fields in which the pilgrims might sleep. Ars, which had drawn small crowds of noisy, drunken revelers in the old days, now drew vast armies of quiet, intent, and prayerful people. Sick people were cured at St. Philomena's shrine. Suffering minds were eased by the curé. Diseased souls were made well again. "Just to talk to him," the pilgrims would say. "If I can just talk to him, I know everything will be better for me." But to talk to him required hours of patient waiting. Day after day, week after week, month after month, Father Vianney heard the recital of the people's sins, reprimanded and advised the penitents. Of course, not all who came were sinners. There were the pious and good, too, who wanted counsel and direction for the betterment of their lives. One such, going into the sacristy where the curé sometimes spoke with the people, saw a beautiful lady in blue talking to the priest. He had come upon the Curé of Ars getting help and wisdom from the Mother of God herself. In 1835, Father Vianney was making preparations to go away on his own concerns. As he bustled about checking on various details before leaving, his hair, snowy white, although he was only 41, blew in the wind, and his cassock flapped around his hurrying legs. He had hoped for a long time to be able to make a retreat, and now he was arranging for a few days at his old seminary, where a group of his confreres were going for a time of spiritual reinvigoration. Before he could leave, of course, there were innumerable things to be done. He was happy in the thought that he would soon be having a few hours of recollection of the solitude which had been denied him for so long. He wanted help in deciding whether it was conscience or the devil which constantly whispered in his ear, "You are no good as a priest. You are falling in your tasks. You should resign from your parish and leave it to a priest who can really do the work." Torn as he always was, and would be to the end of his days, between his duty to God and his duty to man, the curé had decided that the people of Ars could wait while he got the help he felt he needed. Monsignor Devy, who was in charge of the seminary, knew the sanctity of the curé, knew of the immense and needed work for souls that he was doing, work the curé could never properly evaluate himself because of his saintly humility. "You do not need a retreat," Monsignor Devy said firmly. "The people of Ars and those who come to Ars need you very badly. And I repeat, you do not need to be here. You are to go back, and now." Slowly and sadly, before the retreat had even begun, the curé went back to his parish, back to the thousands of people who wanted his decisions and advice, to the long days and nights in the confessional. Again the days and weeks and months went by, and as they grew into years, an idea became more firmly fixed in Father Vianney's mind. Anyone, he felt in his humility, could do the work he was doing. To save his own soul, he was certain, he should live out the rest of his life in a monastery where he could spend his hours in prayer and meditation, making himself a better priest than he believed himself to be. He asked Monsignor Devy for permission to make the move, but was refused. He prayed very hard and asked again. Again he was refused. He pondered the two great commandments and trembled with fear that in obeying the second, love of neighbor, he was slighting the first, love of God. He was torn between his duty as parish priest and his desire for a life of prayer and penance, for he saw himself as a miserable sinner. "God wants every man to save his soul," he told himself. "I have been here a long time, but I do not feel as if I were making any progress on my own road to heaven, so I will leave and go to a monastery." These thoughts came only from the curé's humility and his deep love of God, but the devil seemed to think differently. He seemed to think he had won. There were none of the rappings and bangings in the curé's little house that night. Everything was quiet, and the world was at rest. All the world, that is, except Father Vianney. He was excited, half a little boy running away from home, and half a man who had come to a grave decision and was going to act on it. His breviary, his rosary, and a few books of spiritual reading were packed in a small bundle with his clothing. He went quietly out of the house, and under the dark high dome of the sky. He walked down the lonely road. It chanced that he had finished hearing the confessions of all the waiting pilgrims that day, and the line had not formed outside the church in readiness for him to appear the next day, so there was no one to see his escape. He walked along the road, drawing clear air deep into his lungs, looking at the far-off stars and thinking of the Creator who hung them there and kept them in their courses. A trowel near the crossroads reminded him of the Holy Child's first crib. The stark arms of a dead tree, spread wide against the night glow, brought a sob from his throat as he thought of the God-man's last torturing bed. He fingered the rosary in his pocket, asking Christ's mother to bless him on his journey. His heart leaped in joy as he thought of days and nights when he could spend uninterrupted hours in prayer and contemplation. Then he could praise God and serve Him, could be sorry for his sins and the sins of the world. The sins of the world! As he looked around the fields now, he was aware of people sleeping on the ground. They were pilgrims on their way to Ars. Suppose there was one among them who was a real sinner, who had had to wrestle with himself to get this far, and if he went to Ars next day only to find that the man on whose help he counted was gone, he might well turn away and go back to his evil ways. The curé kept walking, but his step was slower. A soft night breeze brushed down his face. Far off on some tree-hidden farm, a dog barked at the moon, which had just come above the horizon. Father Vianney smiled at this echo of a timeless feud. Then his face sobered again, as his mind went back to the brightness and justice of his escape from his parish. "Father, my husband died, and I am penniless. Father, the boys in my village say. Father, I can't seem to pray, and—" The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Voices of the pilgrims who traveled long miles to see and talk with and listen to the Curé of Ars. Then he seemed to hear another voice asking him a question. "Hasn't God called you to serve Him as the parish priest of Ars?" A groan came from Father Vianney's throat. He knew the answer, but did not want to admit it. He thought of the quiet, the lovely order of days in the monastery. He could pray there, He could praise God and adore Him. For a moment he stood in the sweet dark, the soft air. Then, sadly, determinedly, he turned around and trudged back to Ars. The crowd when he reached there had begun to form outside the church. Father Vianney slipped quietly into his house. When he went out to the confessional an hour or two later to start his 18-hour day, his serene, loving face gave no clue to the battle he had fought and won that night. Patient, gentle, stern when need be, he listened, and he said to each one just what that person needed to hear. One May evening, 3 years later, he collapsed while speaking in the pulpit. He had driven himself unmercifully for years, had demanded from his frail body work that would have killed a giant. Now he had little reserve energy with which to fight the pneumonia which set in. For 9 days he hung suspended between life and death, between the heaven he longed for and the earth which gave him such a heavy task to fulfill. Then, while a priest friend was saying the Mass of St. Philomena for the Curé's recovery, he turned the corner and was out of danger. But his recovery was long and hard, made harder because once again the longing for the silence and order of the cloister swept over him. The Viscount of Ars, who had been his friend for many years, came to call one day. He found the Curé sitting up in bed, his eyes filled with tears. The nobleman was frightened. "What is the matter? Are you in pain? I will call." "No, don't call anyone." The Curé was weak but decided. "It is just that I am longing for solitude. All my life, it seems, I have longed for solitude, and I've never had it." But as he grew a little stronger, he decided that he would have it. Forgetting his decision of 3 years ago, he determined to be rid of the weight of other people's problems and free to devote himself to prayer and penance. The Vicar General urged him to take the 2 weeks' vacation allowed to every priest in the diocese, to take longer if that was necessary to build up his strength again. A curate had come to share the work. The Curé listened and planned, but told no one of his decision. Now was his chance, he told himself, to leave Ars and the work which he was sure he was not doing well. In September, when he felt he had enough strength for walking, he once again stole out of his house in the darkness, carrying the little bundle of his worldly possessions. He planned to go to Lyons and seek refuge in a monastery there. He had not gone far when he heard footsteps behind him. "It is someone following me," Father Vianney decided, "someone who will want me to go back. But I won't. The bishop has sent me a curate, and a young, strong man can do better work than I. I'll hurry a little." But the footsteps behind him speeded up too, and several voices spoke in the dark. "Father Vianney, I need to consult you. Father Vianney, will you bless this rosary? Father Vianney, will you advise me?" The Curé ignored them, walking along as rapidly as he could, determined on getting to the heaven he longed for. The pilgrims followed a little longer, and then began dropping back, unsure of how to act in this unexpected situation. One young man stayed with the Curé, suspecting his plans, but anxious to serve. "I am not asking you to stay, Father Vianney, but let me go with you to carry your bundle. That is all I ask." They walked through the night, saying the rosary together. Then thin dawn came, lighting the highway. Father Vianney was disturbed. "If we keep to the road, we will surely meet carriages bringing people to Ars," he said to his companion, "and pilgrims on foot use this road too. They may recognize me." The young man agreed that they undoubtedly would. "Then we must cut across country. We'll go through these woods. They'll bring us out to a lane leading to a back road." Walking on the highway taxed the strength of the priest, who had not yet fully recovered from his illness, but the route he now took in his flight was hard even for his young companion. Briars caught at their clothing, and branches raked their faces and hands. They slipped unwarily into holes covered by the carpet of leaves on the ground. Sharp roots cut first one of Father Vianney's shoes and then the other, but he trudged on. He was away from Ars now, and would continue his journey. The sun climbed the heavens, seemed to pause overhead for a moment, then began its descent. The Curé was moving even more slowly now, but still he kept walking. It was dark when they reached Dardilly, the town of Father Vianney's birth. "Why, this is only 20 miles from Ars," the young man said to himself. "I could have come here and back in the 18 hours we have been walking." He looked at the frail man beside him. The priest's feet were torn and bleeding, and his breath came in painful, tearing gasps. It did not seem possible that the thin, almost emaciated body could be forced to go farther. "And now, Father Vianney?" he asked. "My brother Francois. His home is near. I will go there and rest a little before I continue on my way to Lyons. You rest a little too before you go back to Ars. We have come a long way, and thank you for accompanying me." The curé needed more than a little rest. Sick and utterly exhausted, he was at once put to bed. His companion went back to Ars, and Ars filled with consternation at the loss of its saint. It was on the 12th of September that Father Vianney left Ars. On the 13th a letter arrived from the Countess in the chateau outside the village, asking if there was anything she could do that would convince him he should return. On the 14th the mayor of Ars wrote to Dardilly, and at Francois's home asked to be shown into the little first-floor room where he had been told the curé lay. "He is not there," Francois's wife said. "Gone again?" the mayor exclaimed. "May I write a note to leave for him in case he returns?" Mrs. Vianney nodded permission, not explaining that she had simply moved her exhausted brother-in-law upstairs where he might be undisturbed. "I need not tell you, my dear curé, all the sorrow I feel at not finding you here," the letter began. "I came with a great desire to see you and to get your blessing once more," he continued, reminding the curé of how much good Providence was doing, and of how completely it depended on Father Vianney's guidance for its operation. He spoke of the holy souls which you are guiding to heaven, and of those who were far off whom you are leading home. "You need rest," the letter went on, "as no one knows better than I. Stay with your brother as long as is necessary for you, but do not forget your poor parish of Ars." He left the letter to be delivered. It was followed shortly by one from a hotel keeper in Ars, who in the old days had owned one of the crude taverns. "Father Vianney," the man wrote, "I hasten to implore you not to desert us. You know what I have said, and I repeat it now from the bottom of my heart. If there is anything which you disapprove of in my house, I will change it according to your wishes." On the 16th of September, Father Raymond, who had been the curé's assistant in Ars, went to the bishop to ask what he should do. Receiving instructions, he proceeded on to Dardilly. He found the streets filled with pilgrims who had learned where Father Vianney was and had left Ars to seek him out. Father Raymond reported the bishop's directions to Father Vianney. He was not to stay in Dardilly because it was not his own diocese. However, if he really felt he must leave Ars, there were 2 other parishes to which he might go. "Come, Father Vianney," said Father Raymond, "suppose we go and look at the places you are offered." "Yes, I'd better leave here anyway," agreed the curé. "These crowds are making life quite difficult for my brother and his wife." Quietly and unobserved by the waiting crowd of pilgrims, the 2 priests slipped out of the house and began their walk to Beaumont, one of the places the bishop had mentioned. The curé was still far from strong, and as he went along he supported himself on a staff. Father Raymond was worried. It did not seem to him that the older priest could possibly make the trip afoot. Yet they put the miles behind them. When they came to a little town with a chapel, Father Raymond thought it would be a good place to rest. "Instead of reading our office by the wayside," he suggested, "let us stop here and do so." Father Vianney, his voice almost gone since his last illness, nodded. The 2 entered the chapel, went to one of the front pews, and knelt. Father Raymond finished reading first. He raised his head and looked about him and saw, to his amazement, that almost every seat in the church was filled. It was as if people had been summoned by a bell. "Father," he whispered, "all the people from miles around seem to have learned that you are here. I know that you have not the voice to speak to them, but at least give them your blessing." The curé closed his breviary and looked at the crowd. They had come to hear him speak, and, warrior in God's cause that he was, he would not disappoint them. "I will speak to them," he said simply. He went to the front of the church and spoke. And though to the people nearest him his voice was weak, his words were understandable. Moreover, those in the back of the church heard him equally well. The curé finished his talk, gave the congregation his blessing, and the 2 priests started off again. They reached Beaumont that night. The next morning each said his Mass and made his thanksgiving. As they rose from their knees, the curé leaned toward Father Raymond to whisper in his ear. "Let us return to Ars," he said. Chapter 10. No general coming home victorious from the wars, no king returning to his kingdom after a long absence, ever was more royally received than Father Vianney at Ars. The parish, at 5 in the afternoon, lay under a pall of sorrow and loss. A few minutes after 5, the church bells pealed out, the agreed signal if the beloved priest should return. "He is coming! The Curé is coming!" Men threshing wheat left the threshing floor and ran down the road in the hope that they might be the first to see him. Boys helping their fathers in the fields were told to unhitch the horse from the plow and ride to the neighbors with the good news. Women left their baking and cooking, and children ran from their games to pull the Curé's cassock and kiss his hands as he passed. They did not notice, as their elders did, that it was with great difficulty that he dragged himself along. In spite of the pang they felt at the sight of his weakness, the people could not help crowding around him, touching his clothing, assuring themselves that their saint, whom they had feared lost to them, was really back. Some of the men cleared a path for him, so that the exuberant people would not sweep him off his feet. "It was the Blessed Mother who told me to come back," he whispered to Father Raymond. "I thank her, for now there is joy in my heart, and I am at peace." For 10 years more the Curé of Ars continued his work, fighting to win souls for Christ, to help those who were already good to be better. At night the attacks of the furious adversary continued, sometimes subsiding for a day or a week, only to be renewed with redoubled violence. Several times during one night he might be thrown against wall or floor, but always he would arise, shaken but fighting Old Scratch with the powerful weapon of prayer. France had been torn by a dull conflict, with foreign countries and within her own boundaries. Monarchy had been restored for a short time, with Louis Philippe on the throne. But again in February 1848 the country endured a revolution. The king abdicated, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the emperor, was elected president of France. There was revolt in Sicily, in Austria, in Poland. In fact, in all Europe there was not a single country which could claim internal peace. Many people believe that this was the beginning of the abomination of desolation spoken of in Scripture, with nation warring against nation and brother against brother. 1,000 people a day were leaving Europe to seek shelter in the United States, but the states themselves were shaken by dissension on the question of slavery, a problem and quarrel which daily grew more threatening. These world upheavals, however, were unknown to or unnoted by the Curé of Ars. His difficulties were more immediate: the fight for souls who came to him for help, the fight against the once more growing desire to enter a monastery. In 1853 he made his last attempt, and he defeated himself. Wise with inspired wisdom when counseling others, he was so guileless that he was unable to make or keep secret any plans which concerned him. To Catherine Lozane, who was in charge of Providence, he told his scheme, and discussed the running of the orphanage when he should be gone. "I will walk to Lyons," he said. "I have a brother-in-law there, and I know he will lend me a carriage in which I can ride to the monastery of La Neilière, and there I will spend the rest of my days." If it occurred to Catherine that it would be wiser and more expeditious to drive directly from Ars, she did not say so. But she did tell her assistant, Marie Filiat, that the man they thought of as their saint was leaving them. The assistant told some of her neighbors. They told some of the pilgrims. Someone told the assistant pastor. The curé set out at midnight on his third effort to reach the life he yearned for, the life in which he felt he could serve God much better than he believed he was doing in Ars. He was now almost 60 years old. His step was even slower than it had been when he last fled. But there was just as much hope in his heart, just as much iron in the will which kept him pushing along. The houses along the deserted village streets were all closed. His rosary was his only companion. Walking was painful, now. The nights, which in earlier times he had spent sleeping on the cold, damp floor, had given him rheumatism, which tortured him as he plodded along. But his goal, a place of silence and contemplation, seemed so beautiful that the pains of his body were forgotten in the delight of his soul. He plodded on toward the small stream which marked the edge of the town. Twice when he had been told to leave Ars, it was this little stream, flooding over the footbridge, which prevented his departure. He neared that footbridge now. Again it was covered, but not with water. His assistant was there, and the mayor of Ars. People from the village were there, and a few pilgrims. He stopped, aghast. "You cannot stop me," he cried in a wavering voice. "You cannot prevent me from going. I will, because I must." As he spoke, the church bell of Ars rang an alarm. Pilgrims, wondering what the trouble was, rushed out of the houses where they slept and began converging on the place where they saw the glow of lanterns and heard the sound of many voices. When they learned what was going on, they set up a loud cry. "You can't leave us! We need you! We have traveled miles and miles to get your fatherly counsel. You can't leave us orphans!" There were tears from men and women alike. There was sorrow and there was fright. How would they gain heaven, the people thought, if they lost the man on whom they depended to guide them? Bowed with the heavy weight of his strenuous years, Father Vianney stood among them, pitifully thin and worn. His hours in the confessional had carved deep lines of grief into his face, though they had left his mouth firmly tender. Light from the lantern carried by the mare made a halo of his hair, while his brooding eyes seemed to disappear in the shadow of their sockets. A silence fell on the group. No bird stirred in the tree-tops. No animal moved in the underbrush to show fear at this midnight invasion. Even the little stream passed over the rocks without a murmur. Nature, as well as man, seemed hushed and waiting. An expression of physical pain twisted the Curé's face, and he groaned as if he had been shown a cross beyond his strength to carry. He looked around him. There was the girl whose reputation had been bad when he came to Ars. Now she was a fine Catholic wife and mother. Over there was one of the men who had always worked on Sunday in the past. Now neither he nor his family ever missed Mass on Sunday and rarely on weekdays. Among the pilgrims was a couple who, his heaven-prompted intuition told him, were gravely in need of warning and advice. Father Vianney looked across the stream toward the path on the other side, the path which led to solitude. The knuckles of his twisted hand whitened as the rheumatic fingers tightened on his staff. His lips moved in prayer. Then slowly and sadly he turned, saying no word, and walked back to Ars, followed by equally silent men and women. When they reached the church, the curé went into the sacristy and put on his stool. Then he seated himself in the confessional. His dream of solitude and quiet contemplation was over. Not long after Father Vianney had made his last act of renunciation, had resigned himself to living and dying in Ars, the bishop arrived for a visit. By now the curé was involved in many things: Providence, a school for boys, work for the propagation of the Faith Society which Pauline Jaricot had founded, and numerous other projects. He was always in need of money, and it crossed his mind to wonder if the bishop had come to inspect his books. The curé started to make a speech of welcome. Smiling, the bishop waved him to silence. "I have something for you, Father Vianney," he said. He held out a mozzetta, a short cape with a hood which is worn by certain church officials. This one was decorated with a band of purple silk and 2 bands of ermine, the insignia of a canon, one of the special dignitaries of the church. Father Vianney was appalled. "Oh, no, no, please, give it to my assistant. It will look much better on him." A little crowd had gathered on the arrival of the bishop, and they were all amused at the shock in the curé's voice. "It is for you," the bishop said firmly, putting the cape around Father Vianney's shoulders and buttoning the top button. That accomplished, he entered the church intoning the Veni Creator. Behind him walked the vicar general, quite accustomed to ceremonial. Father Raymond was next, happy in the honor which had come to the curé. A little procession of villagers and pilgrims brought up in the rear. And beside the bishop moved Father Vianney, looking for all the world like a man being led to his execution. Honors, he felt, would only add to his burden. Somehow he managed to get through the ceremonies. Somehow he acted as host to his distinguished guests at the little party which neighbor women hastily prepared. Somehow he stammered thanks for the honor and saw his guests depart. Then he hastily removed the cape, folded it, and put it away before he took up his duties again. The drain on his finances had grown as he reached out constantly in new directions. He sold the books in his library, his extra cassocks, his towels and handkerchiefs. His orphanage and the boys' school were fairly well established now, but there was the whole world needing missionaries, and he wanted to help in sending them forth. He also wanted to bring more mission preachers here into Ars. One morning he had an idea which delighted him. He carefully studied the beautiful cape the bishop had given him. "I shouldn't wonder if I could make quite a bit of money for my missions with that," he thought happily. With the silken ermine over the dusty arm of his worn old cassock, he trotted off to the home of Marie Richetier, an unmarried woman of some means. She had always been generous to the church, and had brought as souvenirs of the saint a good many of the things he had sold. "Would you like to buy this cape?" asked Father Vianney as he entered the house. That Mosetta? Surely you aren't going to sell that. The bishop himself gave it to you. I think you will be hurt." "Not at all," the curé interrupted. "He made the gift to give me pleasure, and I will take that pleasure in the form of cash for my missions." Miss Riquetier was confused. If the curé was determined to sell the cape, she would like to have it. On the other hand, should she not try to dissuade him from taking a step which seemed to her ill-advised? "Don't you think you should keep the cape, Father Vianney, if we have distinguished visitors?" "But the one in the tabernacle, surely, is the most distinguished. Who could ever come that we might compare with him? And he has seen me, and helped me, for years in my old cassock, with no fur and satin on top. Come, do you want to buy it?" Miss Riquetier still hesitated. "Do you know what it is worth? I have no idea what to offer." "I have no idea what it costs," protested the bishop. "Suppose we say 15 francs." "It's worth more than that, I'm sure." "Suppose we say 20 francs, then," beamed the curé, happy at doing so well for his beloved charities. "I'll give you 25 francs," decided Miss Riquetier, "although I am not at all sure that is enough." "Yes, I'm certain that is a fair price," said the curé, rising. "And now I'll write to the bishop and tell him about my luck. I'll have enough now to bring some mission priests to Ars. They can preach and do the good that I, in my stupidity, must leave undone." With joy in his heart, Father Vianney sat down to compose the letter to his bishop. "Your lordship," he wrote, "the cape which you had the charity to give me has afforded me great pleasure. Since I had not quite all the money I needed to bring a mission to the parish, I sold the cape for 25 francs. He had, however, to rewrite the letter before sending it. Miss Riquetier, troubled by doubt as to whether she had paid enough for the cape, went to the convent of the nuns who had made it. They told her it had cost 50 francs, so she hurried to the curé and gave him another 25. Father Vianney, therefore, changed the letter to read, "I sold the cape for 50 francs. I am pleased with this price." It never even occurred to him to wonder if the bishop was pleased too. When 2 years later he was appointed a member of the Legion of Honor of France, his reaction was much the same. In 1852, France, once again shifting her form of government, had become an empire, and President Napoleon was proclaimed Emperor of the French. The following year was an uneasy one, marked by plots against the emperor, attempts on his life, and a general seething disquiet among the people. But in 1854, France settled not only her own internal affairs, but most of her difficulties with other nations. Planning began for a big industrial expedition to open in Paris in 1855, on the emperor's birthday. Several people of importance had written to the Minister of State to suggest that France would honor herself by honoring the Curé of Ars. The writers pointed out the sanctity of the humble priest, the work he had done for humanity, calling him a second St. Vincent de Paul. On August 11th, therefore, the Medal of the Legion of Honor was awarded him. As was usual in such cases, the bishop was formally notified first. "You will take the Legion medal to him?" the vicar general asked the bishop. "No, I think not. He doesn't much value what I bring him," replied the bishop with a smile. "Someone close to him should bring it," the vicar general mused. "How about his new assistant? Since the men see each other daily, the curé would not be so likely to dispose of the medal." "Good. We will notify Father Tocquenier that the pastor to whom he has been assigned is to receive the medal of the Legion of Honor from his hands." The young priest was excited by the honor which had come to his curé, and pleased that he had been chosen to make the presentation. He spent several hours composing and memorizing a graceful little speech for the occasion. At noon, the priest, several of the brothers who taught in the boys' school, the 2 women who had helped establish Providence, and a few other old friends went to Father Vianney's house. They knocked, entered, and stood beaming, waiting for the presentation. But the young priest, in the excitement of the moment, completely forgot the words he had prepared. "Here," he said, shoving out the precious red-sealed packet, "they've sent you something. Maybe some relics, or—" Father Vianney took the package quickly and opened it. His face fell. "It's only this," he said, holding up France's most coveted award. "The Medal of the Legion of Honor!" Catherine Lasagne exclaimed, sensing that the curé did not quite understand what it was he held. "Put it on," suggested one of the brothers. "Why?" asked the curé. "What is it?" "At least bless it," said another brother. The curé agreed to that. "Do wear it, Father Vianney," urged Catherine Lasagne. "The people would be so pleased to see it." I have worked among them for many years with no decoration pinned on me," the curé protested. He turned to Father Tocanier. "You may have this," he said. "Show it to anyone who wants to look at it. It's yours to do with as you like. I have no use for it." And he went upstairs to read his office. With the growing fame of Ars as a place of pilgrimage, its curé had been forced to change many of his habits. As a boy in Ecoli, he had given himself a lifelong penance of never eating anything he liked. As a pastor, he had formed the custom of boiling a pot of potatoes once a week, and eating a few of them cold each day for his single meal, scraping off the mold as the end of the week neared. But as his hours in the confessional grew even longer, he couldn't even take the time to boil the potatoes. So he asked the women at Providence to prepare a small bowl of soup for him each day. He had, too, to listen to praise and compliment which disturbed him. Once, when a distinguished visitor pointed out that he, the Curé of Ars, was the first and only honorary canon appointed by the bishop, Father Vianney snorted. "I don't wonder," he said sharply. "He was unlucky in his first choice, and seeing what a mistake he had made, he didn't want to risk doing it again." Chapter 11. As the years passed, the Curé of Ars became still more active in helping missions and charitable projects, anything and everything which would spread knowledge of God and of His love. The generosity and lack of self-interest which long ago had deprived him of his first new suit in Ecoli often impelled him now to give away money which he should have saved for his personal use. Pilgrims coming to Ars often brought substantial gifts of money to the curé, money which he seldom held on to long enough to pay his debts. One day, when he found himself especially pressed for cash, although he had received a good deal in the course of the week, he worked out a plan which he hoped would protect him from himself. He called to him a Mrs. Renard, who helped around the church and made herself useful in straightening out his tangled finances. "Claudine," he told her, "I want you to take on a new duty." "I will be very glad to, Father, if you think I can do whatever it is." "You can. All you need to do is to be very strict. Each day," the curé went on, "I'll empty my pockets and you will take charge of whatever comes out. You are to take good care of the money. And, above all, be on your guard against the Curé of Ars. If he comes asking for any of it, refuse him point blank." Every day from that time on the curé would give all the cash he had to Mrs. Renard, who promptly put it in a strong box. So obedient was she to his directions that its inaccessibility often chagrined the curé when he was unable to give to a person or a charity which appealed to him. Self-denial, of course, was the stuff of which Father Vianney's life was made, and had been for many years. He had long ago imposed on himself the rule never to smell a flower, never to drink when particularly thirsty, never to brush away a fly, never to express disgust at any unpleasant sight or smell, never to complain of discomfort. All his life, even as a boy, he had disliked and suffered from the cold. Yet as a man he refused to do anything to protect himself from it. Once when, after sitting for hours in the confessional, he started to leave, he fell heavily to the floor. Both feet had become numb and dead with the cold. When his distressed parishioners picked him up and would have called a doctor, he held up his thin hand to stop them. "I don't need a doctor," he twinkled. "All I need is a little more caution. After this, on cold days, I'll touch my feet and be sure they are there before I try to walk on them." Privately he told his assistant that night, "I have what I asked for. Long ago I promised God that, if He would let me convert Ars, I'd never complain of any suffering He might send me." The assistant priest remained silent for some time, pondering this strange, gentle man, whose speech was often stumbling and ungrammatical, but who spoke always with such wisdom and assurance that people now flocked from all France, indeed from all Europe, to listen to him. "Who was your master in theology?" the young priest finally asked. "I had the same master as St. Peter," replied the curé simply. There was another pause. The assistant heard the answer, but it was so frank and childlike that it was hard to understand. Yet, now that he and Father Vianney had a few moments together, he wanted to learn more of what made the curé so great, and, if he could, to adopt some of his way of life. "How do you manage to do so much for God?" he asked. Please don't speak that way. I do nothing, and God does so much for me. But this I have learned, and I learned it from the shepherds who are in the fields in the winter time. They build a fire and draw near it for warmth. But from time to time they run about collecting wood to keep the blaze alive. Like them, we must learn how to keep the fire of the love of God alive in our hearts. We must feed the flame with prayer and good works." The curé stopped speaking. It was plain that he was very tired. The wonder was that he was still alive. A man near 70, who still spent 12 or 14 hours a day in the confessional, a man who had passed decades of his life in physical rigors and spiritual battles, enduring at the same time unequal persecution from Satan himself. Nor, with increase of years, was there any let-up in the demands upon him. Rather, he was called upon more and more frequently for advice by fellow priests and dignitaries of the Church. Whether or not he was still haunted by his old longing to go to a monastery where he might live out his life in quiet, solitude, and prayer, no one knew. He no longer spoke of it. The long, strength-consuming years, and now a racking cough, which had held on for a very long time, had made the curé almost voiceless. Yet 200, 300, 400 people a day flocked to Ars to hear Father Vianney speak, to go to confession to him, to get his advice, and his fighting heart would not let go while people needed him. One day in 1858 a priest asked him a question. "Father, if God gave you the choice between going to heaven at once or going on working as you do for the conversion of sinners, which would you choose?" "I'd stay." "But in heaven the saints are so happy. No more troubles, no more temptations." "Yes, the saints are happy enough," said the curé slowly. Then his deep-set eyes began to twinkle. "But they're capitalists. They worked well, of course, because God punishes idleness and only rewards hard work. God loves them and hears when they intercede for us, but they can no longer win souls for Him by labor and suffering as we can." The priest considered that for a moment. "Well, if God were to leave you here below until the end of the world, you'd have all the time you wanted in front of you. Tell me, would you still get up so early?" The curé smiled. "Yes, indeed. I'm not afraid of a little tiredness. I should still be the happiest of priests if it weren't for the thought that I shall have to answer for my priestly responsibilities before the judgment seat of God." The old man's eyes filled with tears. He had such a high regard for the priesthood, its privileges and duties, and was so sure he was failing in his task. For almost 40 years now he had worked up to 18 hours a day. 2 or 3 ounces of food daily had been his nourishment. Yet he felt that there was so much more to be done, so much greater effort to be expended, so much fiercer a fight for souls to be waged. In August of 1858, a priest from a neighboring town called on Father Vianney. Apologizing for his disheveled appearance, the visitor told how he had narrowly escaped injury when his horses shied and threw the carriage into a ditch. "St. Anthony never let anything like that happen to him," observed the curé gently. "How did he prevent it?" asked the astonished priest. "He always traveled on foot," explained Father Vianney with a little smile. The abashed visitor hesitated, then went on to the problem which he had come to discuss. As always, Father Vianney told him what he needed to hear, and he rose to go, enlightened and comforted. "And may I come back next August, Father, to tell you how matters have progressed?" The curé thought for a moment. Then his pain-etched face broke into its ineffably sweet smile. "No, Father, because I shall die early in August of next year." The sure knowledge that he had but a year to live spurred the curé to even greater efforts. He tried to spend more time with the children of the village who had always been his particular love and care. They flocked around him, touching his clothing, clinging to his fingers, loving him. Even the most boisterous of the lads grew soft-spoken and gentle in manners when they drew near him. They seemed to sense that the beloved frail old man would not be with them much longer. But physically frail though he might be, his mind and soul were still indomitable. He was still God's warrior, fighting to help sinners save themselves. One evening, when Father Vianney was preparing to leave after a long day in the confessional, a man came into the sacristy. Tall, well-dressed, he was obviously a person of means and of importance. "Good evening," said the weary priest. He turned back to the confessional, beckoning the man to follow. "Good evening," answered the stranger. Then he went on, "I have not come to go to confession. I have come to reason and argue with you." The curé paused. "Oh, my friend, you have made a great mistake. I am not a reasoner or an argufier. But if you are in need of consolation, and I think you are, kneel there." His finger, thin almost to emaciation, pointed to the prie-dieu where penitents knelt. "Be sure that others have done so before you," the curé went on, "and none have been sorry." The man snorted. "I have already told you, Father Vianney, that I have not come for confession, and for a very good reason. I do not believe in confession. I do not believe in anything. I have no faith. Oh, I used to have, but I am wiser now." The Curé of Ars was aghast. "No faith? My dear man, how I pity you! You are wiser, you say? Why, a child of 8 who has learned his catechism knows more than you do." The man who had come to argue with a simple country priest became angry. He, an important person, in his own mind at any rate, had intended to reason with the curé, to explain to him the stupidity of his beliefs. But the curé was not listening humbly as his would-be instructor felt he should. "You say you have no faith," the priest went on. "You are wrong. You do. I'll be insistent with you, as I shouldn't have been if you had not spoken so foolishly. Kneel down and I'll hear your confession." "But, Father Vianney, this is ridiculous. You are asking me to act in a comedy with you, and I am no comedian." The stranger's voice shook with rage, and his eyes were filled with fury as he looked at the frail priest. The priest looked back in silence. The stranger's eyes dropped. "Kneel there." There was a mingled sweetness and authority in the curé's voice. Seemingly, in spite of himself, the man fell to his knees. He made an unsure and trembling sign of the cross, and stumblingly began to accuse himself of his faults. The Curé of Ars gave absolution and went to the rectory where visitors awaited him. The stranger went into the church. His former arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a strange peace. "What a man he is!" he murmured as he slipped into a pew and knelt on the hard foot bench. "What a man! No one ever spoke to me in that way before. If he had not taken hold of me in just the way he did, who knows when I would have made my confession? I might have died without—" The self-important man without faith bowed his head and wept. Pastors from nearby villages had, for some years past, brought their first communion classes to the Curé of Ars for instruction, a duty and privilege which had always delighted Father Vianney. This year it seemed to some of the adults observing him that he was even more eager, that his eyes burned more brightly, as he watched the boys and girls preparing for the great day of their lives. In the spring of 1859, an old friend of the curé went to Ars, and, not having seen him for some time past, was shocked at the extent to which he had failed. "I learned that for a long time past," he wrote to a friend, "Father Vianney had seemed to sustain by the breath of life." The little thread of voice left to him could be heard only by a very attentive ear. All the energy of his life and mind seemed concentrated in his eyes, which burned like 2 brilliant stars in their deep recesses, betokening strength and weakness, life and death. The old warrior knew that his fighting days were drawing to a close, that it would soon be time for him to leave the church militant. But as long as he remained on earth, he would not retire from the lists. The world was in a disturbed condition. In the United States, the question of slavery was increasingly agitating the people. France was once again at war with Austria. In June of 1859, a heat wave began, spreading from California to mid-Europe, sapping the strength of healthy people, ending the lives of those already ill. All June it continued, and on into July. Ours was damp and stifling, but the pilgrims continued to come, hundreds each day, and the curé continued to hear confessions. From 1 o'clock in the morning, through the cruel heat of an unbelievably long day, he remained at his post. It was a slow and painful martyrdom. The sharp cough which had plagued him for 25 years was more tearing and incessant than ever. Several times he fainted, but always swore to secrecy anyone who might have been near when he fell. He talked at more frequent intervals of Philomena, his dear little saint, and even admitted to Father Tolkenier that God had permitted her, on occasion, to come down from heaven to advise him. The heat grew greater and more stifling. Each morning the sun would go down in an angry-looking mass of flames. Each morning it arose, sullen and burning. On the 29th of July, the curé put in his usual 17-hour day. Finally, he said his night prayers at the shrine of St. Philomena, and returning to his house, sank into a chair. "I can do no more," he gasped. Chapter 12. The church bell rang at midnight, the hour at which the Curé of Ars always arose to start his day. But this time he made no move. Finally he was able to call out, and Catherine Zanne, who had worked with him for many years, hurried in from an anteroom where she was waiting. "My humble end has come." The words were barely audible. "You must get my confessor, Father Balley." "I'll get the doctor, too." "It would be a waste of time," whispered the curé. "He wouldn't be able to do anything for me, so don't disturb him." Father Tocanier reached the curé's room just after Catherine left on her errand. "Father Vianney," he said, "St. Philomena cured you 16 years ago, and I'm sure she'll cure you now." "St. Philomena won't be able to do anything this time." The pilgrims couldn't believe the news. The Curé of Ars, whom they had traveled so many miles to see, could not see them. For a while they were stunned. Then, forgetting their own troubles, disregarding the problems they had come to discuss, they began storming heaven with prayers for the gentle martyr inside the little house. The heat continued. Pilgrims vied with parishioners for the privilege of standing on the roof of the curé's house in the killing sun and pouring water on roof and walls in the hope of cooling the rooms a little. Night and day there was no end to the prayers, the pleading that heaven would leave a little longer in Ars the curé they loved and needed. The evening of Tuesday, August 1st, the curé asked that on the following day he be given the last sacraments. As Father Balley came with the sacred host, the streets were lined with kneeling people. "How good God is," whispered Father Vianney. "When you can't go to him any more, he comes to you." Tears streamed down the old man's face. "Is the pain worse?" asked the priest at his bedside. "Is that why you cry?" "No, I cry because it is so sad to receive communion for the last time," said the curé. Priests from various parishes of the diocese streamed in to pray at the bedside of the dying man and to say Mass for him in the little church where he had served. Parishioners and pilgrims stood in the hall outside the door of the room where he lay, and, at intervals, he would feebly raise his hand to bless them. The Bishop of Belley hurried to Ars, and passing through streets crowded with praying people, hurried to the curé's bedside. He reached it shortly after midnight. Throughout France, prayers were being said for Jean-Marie Vianney. In his room, at 2 a.m, a priest was reading aloud the prayers for the dying. He reached the words, "May the angels of God come to meet him and lead him into the heavenly Jerusalem." Father Vianney smiled and died. The church bells tolled, but the people could not believe their message. He was near death before and was restored by a miracle. It is a miracle that he survived 40 years of the life he set himself. He is so much needed, so much wanted. What will become of us? We have counted on him to cure our sicknesses of body and soul. No one could believe that the Curé of Ars was gone, that their living link with heaven was snapped. But someone at last gave the reminder, "He has been our friend on earth. He will continue to be our friend in heaven." The light, thin body of the dead priest was carried downstairs and laid in state in one of the rooms. The venerable face, calm and benign, was left uncovered. A barrier was erected around the bier, and 2 of the brothers who taught in Father Vianney's school kept watch. Their arms grew weary passing backward and forward the crucifixes, rosaries, medals brought by the crowds to be touched to the hands which never again would be raised in blessing. Before dawn on Saturday, people began flocking in from all directions to pay their last respects to the greatly loved Curé of Ars. 300 priests were there, and at least 6,000 people. Father Vianney, who had all his life avoided pomp and praise, could no longer control what went on. The Vianney family and the church dignitaries filled the little church building. Outside, the people knelt on the bare ground through the solemn High Mass. For over 30 years before the death of the gentle warrior of Ars, pilgrims coming to see the curé had asked, "Where is the saint? We want to see the saint." The curé was not long dead when a movement was started to begin the process by which Rome officially confers the title of sainthood. In 1872, Jean-Marie Vianney was declared venerable, the first step toward canonization. A black marble slab covered the grave where the curé's body lay, and to it came scores of pilgrims praying for favors, material and spiritual. Nearby a church was rising dedicated to St. Philomena, the church that Father Vianney had always longed to build. In 1905, Rome conferred on him the title of Blessed, and a little chapel in St. Philomena's church was dedicated to him. His body was placed in a reliquary over the altar, and the shrine became known for the miracles obtained through the intercession of the humble priest. The Pope had declared Blessed Jean-Marie Vianney the patron of the parish priests of France, and they flocked to his chapel. Frequently Masses followed in succession from dawn to noon. as priests went to the altar of the chapel of St. Philomena's Church, asking help in the performance of their duties from the priest who had done his work so supremely well. In 1925 he was declared a saint. The Pope now announced that he was the patron of the parish priests of the world. From all over the world they came, singly and in pilgrimages. They prayed in the church and in the chapel. They saw the wooden confessional, where, through long and painful years, the Curé of Ars sacrificed himself to save more souls for God. They saw the old house, which had been his home, the house made dreadful so many nights by a furious, frustrated Satan. They saw the simple room where he died, unchanged since he had left it. They prayed that they might share the dedicated spiritual courage of the simple farmer's son, who could not learn, but learned. They thought of the obstacles in his path to ordination, obstacles which would have defeated a less valiant soul, but which he overcame. They remembered his tenderness to those in sorrow, his vigor with those in sin. They bowed their heads in recollection of the peasant Jean-Marie Vianney, who for over 40 years was the Curé of Ars, and who was now St. Jean-Marie Vianney, beloved throughout the world. End of The Man Who Fought the Devil by Eva K. Betts.